you were around Santa Monica in November 1986, and if you somehow found yourself in attendance at that year's American Film Market event, and if you were a fan of the Marvel Comics title Spider-Man, then you were no doubt excited to see the following presentation pop up on the big screen.
Within this unsuspecting city, history's greatest experiment creates tomorrow's greatest superhero. Spider-Man, the movie. A live-action spectacular directed by Joe Zito, based on the characters created by Stan Lee.
With hindsight, we know that Canon Films' Spider-Man the movie, as directed by Joe Zito, was never to be. It was to be the cinematic debut of the world-famous superhero, and would have presented the story of Peter Parker, a teenager whose ordinary life is transformed into something greater when he is bitten by a radioactive spider. Peter would then wage a one-man crusade against crime in the costumed identity of the Amazing Spider-Man, leading to a dramatic battle that sees millions of lives hanging in the balance, high above Manhattan's glittering skyline. The feature film rights to Spider-Man were held by Menahem Golan and Globus, the chairman and president of Canon Films. Golan and Globus had purchased the company when it hit financial trouble, and they immediately launched a 10-point manifesto, vowing to supply a minimum of 10 quality films a year. Golan had previously worked for indie icon Roger Corman, learning the principles of budget-on-a-shoestring filmmaking. From there, Golan got together with Globus, and the two made a number of no-budget titles in their homeland of Israel. Once at Canon, they would turn out movies at a rate of more than 20 a year. The two cousins were super passionate about cinema, or at least Golan was. Globus was perhaps more passionate about business, but together they had a vision of sorts. The only thing Menahem Golan cared about was making movies. Some were great, some were poor, some turned a profit, others lost millions. But from his youth right up until his final hours on Earth, all Golan ever cared about was movies. But sadly, as is often the case with the rise and fall of any empire, mistakes were made. The duo had paid an upfront fee to license the characters Spider-Man and Captain America from Marvel. The movie deal promised Marvel a back-end percentage of any future box office revenue. The option was a 5-year, potentially extendable agreement. And, depending on which source you trust, the initial fee, to be paid in installments, seems to fall somewhere between $225,000 and $400,000. The allure of realizing superheroes in a motion picture was at an all-time low. Richard Lester's Superman 3 had disappointed audiences 2 years prior, and Tim Burton's Batman was still another 5 years away from redefining the genre. When Stan Lee's agent, Don Kopaloff, went looking for buyers, Canon Films were the only serious takers. Kopaloff, an industry veteran of William Morris and ICM fame, would later say of the sale, quote, "I would never have gone to Canon as a first choice. I went to them after I couldn't get Captain America or Spider-Man sold. The younger people in the film industry were plenty interested, but the older people who were still in charge didn't bite. I would never have gone to Canon as a first choice." If we scroll back in time to 1976, CEO James Galton had just taken over the reins at Marvel. The company was teetering on the brink of a potential demise and down to its last $12 million. The new CEO would restructure the distribution models, getting comics directly to fans rather than through a third-party middleman. Deadlines and strict release dates were introduced as the company's old "you'll get it when it's ready" approach was discarded. Galton famously secured the rights to create Star Wars-based comics a few months before the movie was released, and he would also set up an animated division, Marvel Productions Limited. Stan Lee had been promoted to editorial director and publisher of Marvel Comics in 1972. Now, he was put in charge of the new Offshoot label, which was designed to focus on building the brand and transitioning Marvel's catalog of characters into other media, into cartoons, and eventually live-action feature films. The move would give rise to Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends in 1981 and The Incredible Hulk in 1982. But what Stan Lee wanted more than anything else was to see those characters handled on the movie screen, with big budgets, famous actors, and big-time filmmakers. Star Wars had proven that there was an audience out there that was starved of big-screen fantasy and science fiction. And Richard Donner's Superman, the motion picture, showed what could be achieved if the material was treated with respect. Lee would relentlessly promote the stable of heroes at every opportunity, armed with a catalog of titles and characters and storylines that Lee knew was being underappreciated by the powers that be. Any executive with the authority to greenlight films would look down upon comic book collecting as nothing more than a hobby indulged by children. Lee continued to promote the Marvel superheroes and conducted hundreds of interviews, making guest appearances, signings, conventions. From the mid-70s to the mid-80s, Lee was a one-man promotional army and was willing to talk to anyone who would listen about the potential of a Marvel Comics cinematic universe. A story treatment for a Spider-Man movie put forward that year by Steve Krantz would amount to nothing. Krantz was the head of Krantz Films Incorporated, and he had produced the animations The Marvel Superheroes and Spider-Man in the 1960s. Krantz's pitch initially began life as an all-dancing, all-singing musical production, before deciding to adapt Jerry Conway's The Night Gwen Stacy Died from The Amazing Spider-Man number 121 and 122, albeit with the addition of a 100-foot-tall robot and the Nazi armed forces. The rights lapsed before anyone got around to developing either version. Lee had previously tried to connect Krantz with French experimental filmmaker Alain Resnais, who had expressed a desire in conversation to shoot a Spider-Man movie. Resnais was a fan of Lee and Marvel, claiming that he learned to speak English by reading comic book dialogue. After exchanging letters, Resnais would arrange to visit New York's Marvel headquarters. The two would become friends, and Resnais would move into Lee's guest house. The first to the finish line was an original screenplay titled The Monster Maker. The film about man-made pollution and the destructive dark cloud that hovers over humanity was due to be filmed on New York's Rat Island. But creative differences with a producer would end that project before any deals had been finalized. The pair would continue to take creative meetings to discuss ideas. They would walk to Manhattan's Chinatown and sit at their favorite table at the Nomois Tea Parlor. Yet, despite Resnais's admiration of Spider-Man, all plans for any subsequent collaboration on a cinematic Spider-Man would dissolve. Instead, 1977 would see the first appearance of Nicholas Hammond's turn as Spider-Man in the television series The Amazing Spider-Man. The classic show ran for 2 seasons, and was canceled, along with Wonder Woman, due to the CBS network's fear of becoming known as a comic book network. Lee had previously sold the rights on behalf of Marvel to CBS to make the primetime show, but he remained unhappy with budgetary constraints that limited the action scenes and effects. This was a problem that would also later plague 1979's small-screen Captain America and Captain America 2: Death Too Soon. Lee still retained the film rights, and would write his own treatment for a potential live-action Spider-Man origin movie based on the character's first appearance in Amazing Fantasy issue 15. Lee would also produce outlines for movies based on Nick Fury, The Human Torch, Doctor Doom. He took meetings with actor Carl Weathers about starring in an adaptation of Luke Cage, also known as Power Man. There was talk of a Tom Selleck-led Doctor Strange. ABC had planned a live-action Daredevil pilot written by Oscar-winning writer Sterling Siliphant. That project went nowhere, along with an Ant-Man TV show and a proposed Silver Surfer movie that Lee had been super excited about making with Olivia Newton-John's manager. The Incredible Hulk and 11 other Marvel characters had already been licensed out to Universal Television in a move that would introduce the wider world to Bill Bixby's Dr. Banner and Lou Ferrigno's Green Goliath. Lee believed The Incredible Hulk captured the essence of the comic book. He said, quote, "The Hulk television show I thought was wonderful. Kenneth Johnson was so smart. He took a character which in live-action television might have been unbearably foolish-looking with nonsensical stories, and he made it as palatable for grown-ups as for kids. Because what he did If you remember that series, it was an hour-long show. And in the course of the hour, you only actually saw the Hulk, Luke Ferrigno, for 5 or 6 minutes. The rest of the time, it was Bruce Banner, played by Bill Bixby, as a very human, empathetic character that you cared about. So it was really an adult show about an interesting, complex hero with a lot of personal problems. There was a Wonder Woman telemovie starring tennis player turned actor Kathy Lee Crosby that would precede the Linda Carter TV show by a year, and would subsequently receive negative feedback for ignoring the comic book storyline and replacing the iconic outfit with blonde hair and a 1970s belter jacket. The film was actually a feature-length pilot for an intended television series being considered by ABC, but ABC didn't pick it up. ABC would end up developing a different Wonder Woman television concept that fit the more traditional presentation of the character. This particular portrayal of Wonder Woman was based upon the I Ching period in the comics when Diana had given up her superpowers and instead learned martial arts from the namesake master to work as a civilian crime fighter. Though by the time it aired, Wonder Woman had become a superhero again in the comics. One of the auditionees for the title role in that telemovie was Angela Bowie, the wife of rock star icon David Bowie. While she didn't land the role in what seems to have been a convoluted publicity stunt to promote her husband's music, she would later recount the experience in her book, writing, quote, "Wonder Woman, the comic book character, that is, lush black hair, projectile memories, superpowers, the works. She first entered my life courtesy of an agent in a scheme that involved getting me a screen test for the Wonder Woman part in the television series, then in development, so that I could be on The Tonight Show hosted by Johnny Carson. Of course, so that I could promote David's 1980 floor show edition of the Midnight Special. The fact that the wife of a major British rock star was in Hollywood to try out for the starring role in an American TV series, I was a good enough hook for Carson's people. Just dandy, in fact. And so the deal was done. As far as Wonder Woman was concerned, my vision of the title character hadn't been too far off the money. When I first saw the show on TV, I was mildly sickened, if not exactly surprised, to note that the script had veered sharply away from its Ms. Wholegrain angle. Now it featured the classic cartoon approach, and Linda Carter was running around in an exact duplicate of my costume. Bowie did, 2 years later, receive permission from Stan Lee to hold the rights to Daredevil and Black Widow. A photo shoot took place in London using costumes and makeup to show a proof of concept, although Bowie would later state the projects were deemed too expensive and tricky to get correct, and the 12-month option expired. Stan Lee still hoped Renee remained interested in directing Spider-Man. A letter dated April 1980 would see Lee tell the French director that he had been speaking to Happy Days star Henry Winkler about starring in a big-budget Spider-Man movie, and Winkler was both excited about the role and about the idea of taking direction from Renee. Lee continued to promote Spider-Man at every opportunity on TV. He still relentlessly attended fan conventions, always happy and eager to sign books, pose for pictures, and answer questions he'd already been asked 1,000 times before. Comic book sales were on the rise again, with Marvel titles producing some iconic stories during this time. Collectors had started to make serious money from the trade and sale of back issues, and so the number of comic shops soared as a hobby became a lifestyle. And yet, despite Stan's publicity trail extending far and wide with the remit to pitch everywhere and anywhere to everybody and anybody, it started to look as if Marvel couldn't even give their characters away for free. Lee even took to Variety magazine and paid for adverts outlining a list of Marvel characters whose movie rights were up for sale. At this time, both Marvel and DC had policies in place that led to a smaller and smaller number of distributors controlling all comic sales. Stan Lee would task his vice president of business affairs, Alice Donenfeld, with pounding the streets from New York to California to France and back again, on loop, in the hopes of securing a sale. The since-retired executive would later recall, quote, "Every one of them would say to me, We're not going to make a movie of any of your dumb superheroes. The theaters are going to be dark at night. We can't play kids' movies after 6 o'clock at night. It's not worth the money. Marvel caught a break, it seemed, when Nelvana Films optioned the X-Men with the hope of making a summer blockbuster that would require a big production, cutting-edge effects, and a comics-faithful storyline. Comics legend Chris Claremont was hired to write many various outlines across 1981 to 1983. Claremont, a British-American comic author, would write a legendary run on the title, spanning over 16 years from 1975 to 1991, and most definitely seemed to be the best writer for the job. Orion Pictures had secured a distribution deal, and Marvel were in for a lucrative share of merchandising dollars. As Claremont's work remained unfilmed, in 1984, all script duties were handed over to comic writers Roy Thomas and Jerry Conway. Thomas and Conway would hammer out one outline after another. Most versions centered around a plot where Charles Xavier gathers his first team of X-Men in order to defeat an organization known as Proteus, and a giant mutant island that wants to become a new continent. A story with noted similarity to Krakoa from Giant Size X-Men #1. Everyone at Marvel was excited that X-Men could indeed be the title that would become Marvel's first big-budget movie. But then, Orion hit financial trouble and would merge into what is now MGM. Nelvana's rights to the property soon expired, leaving Fox to swoop in and acquire the title for itself. But still, despite talking openly of loving all of the characters equally, Stan Lee continued to dream of seeing an epic, high-budget, effects-laden Spider-Man film. The decision to up sticks and relocate to the West Coast permanently was confirmed in Lee's mind when, during a trip to LA, his home back in New York was burgled and over $100,000 worth of his wife's jewelry was stolen. Lee's first real brush with the Hollywood machine would be when the character Howard the Duck was adapted for live action, but the George Lucas-produced comedy was deemed a commercial failure. In November 1986, 3 months after the release of Howard the Duck, Marvel Comics' group was sold off by its parent company, Cadence Films, for a fee of around $46 million to the production and distribution house New World Pictures. New World Pictures was the company started and sold by Roger Corman. Corman, coincidentally, had seen himself attached for a couple of years to a Spider-Man movie, although Corman and Lee didn't see eye to eye when it came to agreeing upon a vision for the film. With a light-touch comic book plot written by Lee that would see Peter Parker in college, caught in a love triangle between Mary Jane Watson and a Russian femme fatale, before doing battle with professor-turned-master criminal Dr. Octopus on top of the United Nations building as he prevents the start of a nuclear war, Lee wanted to see a big budget, whereas Corman was looking to knock it out in a more cheap and cheerful fashion. Corman's option expired, and the B-movie artist would instead produce a small-budget take on Marvel's Fantastic Four for the company Constantine Films. Once New World Pictures had completed the purchase, they soon realized they'd bought the wrong company. President Bob Raimi announced to his staff, "Good news, we've just bought Superman." Mr. Raimi was asked, "Have Warner Brothers sold DC Comics?" "No," replied Raimi, "we bought Marvel." He was then informed, "That isn't Superman, that's Spider-Man." Raimi was said to have been horrified as he put the 2 and 2 together. "But wait, Canon Films is making Spider-Man? Oh, no, we gotta put a stop to this deal." But it was too late. The ink was dry, and the contract was binding. It was a year prior to New World's acquisition of Marvel that the film rights to Spider-Man had been purchased by Canon Films. New World tried, and failed, to pry the Spider-Man film rights away from Canon. And less than 12 months would pass before New World would go bust. A movie treatment titled Spider-Man Operation Z was written by Jim Shooter, who was then editor-in-chief of Marvel. Shooter uploaded the text to his website with the preface, quote, "Here's the original treatment. I think it was written for Canon Films during the Globus days. Nothing ever came of it." Shooter's outline begins with Peter Parker waking up, turning off his alarm, crawling around the ceiling by his fingertips. He eats breakfast, then checks in on his dear Aunt May. He attends university and finds himself distracted lately. But even on his worst day, he outshines the rest of the class. Peter has to turn down social invites and parties so that he can look after his aunt. She's getting old and frail, and money worries are never far away. The newspaper headlines report that the feds are closing in on a criminal boss known as the Kingpin. Peter takes a look at the bills that are stacking up and heads out. He ducks into an alley and removes his shoes before running up a wall. He carries web fluid cartridges, a spider signal, and a mini camera on his belt. Once atop the building, he pulls out a pre-stashed Spider-Man costume and swings into action. He leaps and shoots web lines as he sails from building to building looking for a crime in progress. He foils an illicit transportation of stolen chemical drums. Peter's positioned camera snaps photographs of the heroic deed. The prevention of the chemical robbery is a minor setback in Kingpin's plan, an evil scheme codenamed Operation Z. Irritated by the inconvenient timing of Spider-Man's interference, he recruits Bullseye, his chief lieutenant and assassin, to find Spider-Man and end him. Peter sells his exclusive Spider-Man photographs to newspaper editor J. Jonah Jameson for half the price they're worth. The money temporarily eases the money troubles. At the bank, Peter meets a beautiful girl called Lynn. His spidey senses alert him to two mugger types loitering outside. Peter and Lynn chat, and she leaves. The men pounce and try to mug her. Peter rushes to her rescue and saves her. A grateful Lynn offers to buy Peter a coffee. He agrees, but first he needs to check in on his Aunt May. When he returns from the phone booth, Lynn has left. Annoyed by the snub, Peter scales the walls and crosses rooftops. He scans the streets below and spots her train. He jumps to the station and lands just as she gets off. Flattered by his persistence, the two start dating, and as their romance develops, they make a cute couple. Meanwhile, there's more news reports about the chemical robberies and the criminals who continue to evade detection and capture. Peter plans to raise more money to take Lynn on a date by taking more pictures of himself stopping the next chemical robbery and selling the prints to the Daily Bugle. Later, as he positions his camera and attempts to thwart the next hijacking, his spidey senses alert him to incoming danger. It's a trap! Bullseye and a dozen of his finest, heavily armed crime soldiers are waiting in ambush. They open machine gun fire. Spider-Man dodges and outmaneuvers the spray pattern of the bullets. Bullseye steadies his aim and forces a deadly poison dart full of toxic chemicals. Spider-Man is hit. He retrieves his camera and crawls away to safety. Kingpin orders Bullseye to stake out every hospital in the city and wait for a wounded superhero to stagger in. Spider-Man does head to the hospital, but spots some unsavory characters waiting outside, and so instead follows a doctor home and begs for help. Peter awakens at the doctor's home the next day. Peter's incredible metabolism eventually overcomes the toxin by itself. Peter tries to explain his absence to Lynn, who has dumped him. Peter reveals his identity as Spider-Man and explains that once he was just another normal high schooler living in Queens with his Aunt May, and Uncle Ben is a bookworm with a love for science. He's mocked by the other kids. One day after school, during a demonstration of new radioactive technology, a little spider happened to pass through the energy field and became irradiated. The spider bit him, and the bite gave him the proportional strength, reflexes, and wall climbing ability of a spider. Lynn is stunned. She apologizes and asks him to marry her. Peter accepts. Meanwhile, Kingpin works out by battling several strong-looking karate experts. He takes on his opponents in groups and defeats them without breaking a sweat. As he trains, he chats to Bullseye. Kingpin reasons that if Spider-Man has survived the poison dart, well, then the toxin he has in his possession is a clue that will lead back to Operation Z. Kingpin sends Bullseye to hunt Spider-Man down once and for all. Spider-Man starts to investigate the link between the robberies. But Lynn is tired of Peter's superhero antics. She's tired of him selling photographs for pennies to help Aunt May, when instead, he could use his super strength to become a major sports star and set his family up for life. She takes him out to a New York Knicks training session. Peter gets a run out and excels at basketball without even using a fraction of his powers. The Knicks sign him up on the spot and hand him a huge cash signing bonus. He later has second thoughts. He doesn't want to quit studying science to pursue life as a basketball player. Neither does his Aunt May. They have no money because when he was growing up, she spent everything she could on his scientific equipment. He owes it to himself to stay in school. Lynn disagrees and storms off in a huff. Hours pass. Peter receives an anonymous note. His Aunt May and Lynn have been kidnapped, and he needs to be at a location in exactly 1 hour. Spider-Man arrives. He senses the trap and grabs Bullseye by the neck. Spider-Man is shown a screen on which his aunt and fiancé appear as hostages. Spider-Man is told that they'll be safe if he agrees to be held in a vault so that he's out of the way as they execute their plans. Spider-Man agrees. As he enters the vault, Bullseye laughs at him and tells him he's a fool as the vault door is slammed securely shut. Toxic gas begins to pour into the locked vault. There's a screen that shows Aunt May and Lynn getting gunned down. Spider-Man doesn't know that it's two mannequins dressed up to fool Spider-Man into thinking his loved ones are dead, when in fact, Kingpin is being quite charming with them. Spider-Man is enraged. He musters every ounce of strength he has and batters down the reinforced steel door. Bullseye's men wait on the other side, fully locked and loaded. But Spider-Man uses the vault door like a shield and bowls the gunmen over. Spider-Man tracks Kingpin down. He goes into full berserker mode, smashing up anything that moves. He believes his aunt and girlfriend are dead, and he's hell-bent on revenge. We learn of Kingpin's master plan. His plan is to reduce Manhattan to dust with a deadly nerve poison he's paid to have developed. He plans to release the toxin and then leave in a submarine. He'll offer the antidote to the US government in exchange for $11 billion. If the government refuses, well, then 11 million will die. Spider-Man battles his way through hordes of Kingpin's henchmen before finally tracking the big man down. The two engage in an epic battle. Kingpin is stronger than most humans, but it doesn't matter, as Spider-Man is in full rage mode. Bullseye appears and fires at both men. Bullseye's plan was to double-cross his boss and kill Spider-Man. Spider-Man is pinned under falling rubble as fires rip through the building. Kingpin survives the gunfire and kills Bullseye with his bare hands, allowing Spider-Man to push himself free and rescue his family. Kingpin tries to flee in an airship. Once airborne, he plans to release his poison over the city. Spider-Man is in pursuit. He swings and fires webs and catches up to the fleeing madman. He overpowers Kingpin and the airship crashes into the sea. Only Spider-Man emerges from the sea wreck. Later, Peter and Lynn declare their love for each other, just as the coach of the New York Knicks calls up and wants to know why Peter wasn't at the game when the team needed him. The end. It's unknown whether anyone at Canon even bothered reading Shooter's story. Golan was on another wavelength when it came to making movies, and when it came to Spider-Man, it wasn't necessarily a higher wavelength. One for cashing in by chasing and imitating the fads of the day. His movies had taught him that anything featuring ninjas was the key to success in America. Hence, Spider-Man's ninja flying through space pose on Canon's promotional material. The first person given the official commission of writing a Spider-Man film treatment for Canon Films was Leslie Stevens. Stevens had directed the William Shatner horror movie Incubus, and had worked with Canon on writing a sequel to the movie Joe called Citizen Joe that would remain unproduced. Stevens had also written multiple uncredited drafts of the screenplay for the 1983 movie Sahara, based on a story by Golan in what would prove to be a costly flop. Stevens had previously co-developed Universal's feature-length Buck Rogers in the 25th Century and the subsequent NBC television show, which saw him adapting and discarding elements of the classic comic strip in order to update and modernize the story for viewers unfamiliar with the character. The 2-season run of Buck Rogers was considered a success, and Marvel then hired him to work on their title, Dazzler. The character had been created at the behest of Alice Donenfeld. This being the days of disco, the idea was to introduce the character via the X-Men comics and eventually tie in a music deal with a record label. Everyone was impressed with the character and origin story that Shooter developed, and plans quickly shifted from a 30-minute animated piece into a full-length, feature-length film. Shooter's Dazzler treatment gained traction and much interest at the 1980 Cannes Film Festival. Star Bo Derek was quickly attached in principle. As Shooter recalls, quote, "Marvel commissions a screenplay by Leslie Stevens. Why not me? I was the horse who got us there. But suddenly, because it was Hollywood, for real and big time, I was just a comic book writer. They decided they needed a screenwriter. Stevens ignored what I had written completely and wrote a piece of crap that defies description. In those days, despite the reasonable success of the first Superman movie, comics were still thought of as silly and campy, so that's what Stevens went for. It was moronic. Stevens also discarded the light powers and gave Dazzler the power to make people tell the truth. Why the name then? Oh well. And so, any Dazzler film remained unproduced. But Stevens was about to trample more sacred ground with his next Marvel job, Cannon Films' upcoming Spider-Man. As Stevens worked from a jumping-off point by Golan, nobody believes anymore in features based on comic books, Golan had said, and so the two managed to completely ignore the Spider-Man already established to readers and fashion their own body horror tale, which would interpret the character's name quite literally. Stevens was the one who first suggested that Spider-Man would have gotten more than just super strength and the ability to stick to walls from that radioactive spider bite. Stevens' treatment would contain the organic web shooters that remain a through line to James Cameron's treatment up until the Sam Raimi movie. Stevens would then skip all of the basics of the origin story and conjure a central plot that would amp up Peter's metamorphosis. Peter is a science lab photographer and student of ninjutsu who transforms into a giant spider and back into a human until the completion to spider is almost permanent. An increasingly suicidal Peter is horrified by this curse that he sees as a fate worse than death. The architect of his mutation is a scientist who has developed a basement full of genetic experiments. Parker is deliberately blasted in radiation by the evil head of the company, a mad scientist whose purpose is global domination. The scientist uses a seductive female to entice Peter to join his master race of mutants. When the plan fails, Peter is put in a "you're with us or you're against us" conflict. Peter uses his tarantula mutation to battle against a gauntlet of various creatures unleashed by the evil Doctor. It's a fair assumption that Stevens was pulling together various sources of inspiration. All except the Spider-Man comic books, that is. Anyone familiar with H.G. Wells' work would recognize his themes. The concept of evolution versus the divine, and the ethical pitfalls of a scientific inevitability. Stevens had previously adapted Wells' The Invisible Man twice for television, as co-creator of both The Gemini Man, in which secret agent Sam Case is exposed to radiation in an underwater explosion and rendered invisible, and as a writer for The Invisible Man, in which David McCallum's Daniel Weston, while working for a company called the Clay Corporation and doing experiments in teleportation, discovers the side effect of his work is the ability to turn objects invisible. The Wellsian slant on the Amazing Spider-Man wasn't appreciated by those at Marvel. It's been rightfully said, more than once by now, that Golan didn't fully grasp the concept of Peter Parker and the radioactive spider bite. And rather than consult someone who did, he figured he'd reinvent the character and create a monster. Thankfully, the misjudgment was a short-lived brainstorm that went nowhere. And less than a couple of months would pass before those close to Cannon's higher-ups would persuade them to approach the material in the correct way. Cannon would instead let Stevens write and direct the movie Three Kinds of Heat, starring his wife. And his Spider-Man treatment would remain unfilmed, yet forever discussed. I think if you take away any reference to Peter Parker, you have a Dr. Moreau, Swamp Thing, Creature from the Black Lagoon, The Fly, Wolfman, drive-through movie throwback that sounds potentially interesting. The treatment's currently the property of Sony. I hope somebody films it. Following completion of the Stevens treatment, Cannon would market Tobe Hooper to the press as the director of the upcoming film. The director of Salem's Lot and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre had found himself in relative exile from the industry following the controversy of the Poltergeist shoot, where, despite the film bearing Hooper's name as director, a combination of personal issues and Spielberg's enthusiastic yet domineering presence led to an on-set power struggle and the controversial LA Times article where Spielberg was quoted as saying, "Tobe isn't what you'd call a take charge sort of guy. He's just not a strong presence on a movie set. If a question was asked and an answer wasn't immediately forthcoming, I'd jump up and say what we could do." There were later verified as true whispers that the cast and crew began taking their orders from Spielberg, leading the Directors Guild of America to force the E.T. director to take out a full-page apology to Hooper. Hooper was eventually removed in post-production and would always decline to speak of the experience in any real depth. After a year of seeing his projects pulled, including a potential Poltergeist prequel, Golan and Globus would offer Hooper a 3-picture deal. There was a film adaptation of the Colin Wilson novel Space Vampires, later retitled Life Force. There was Invaders from Mars and Spider-Man. If things went well with those 3 projects, Cannon was hoping Hooper would find time to produce a sequel to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and an already fully scripted sci-fi title, Pinocchio the Robot, starring Lee Marvin. Hooper would say, quote, "Things were really corporate at Cannon by the time I got there. But, I could go into their office and in 90 seconds get a green light to do a movie based on a pitch. No intermediate development of script or anything. They'd ask me, 'Tobe, when can we have this on screen?' I must say that I really like that." Life Force was given a $25 million budget, which at the time was an enormous sum equal to the blockbusters of the day. Unfortunately, Life Force didn't fare as well as hoped. Hooper says, quote, "I think the big problem is that they tried to market that movie as a serious science fiction film, which it wasn't. The expectations that were given to that film were like 2001: A Space Odyssey." Hooper had been linked publicly with the Leslie Stevens treatment, but behind the scenes, Marvel's film people and Stan Lee managed to get word to Golan that his mutant spider ninja film wasn't going to succeed in doing anything other than alienating comic book fans. And so there was a period of time where Hooper's name was still being used in trade ads, but no story had yet been given formal approval. After Hooper was coerced into directing, rather than producing, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 in super record time to meet a release date, the film replaced Spider-Man on Hooper's schedule. As the sequel fell behind and the budget continued to increase, Cannon would grow impatient, and even attempted to have him replaced by a company workhorse who could finish the film cheaply. Such a move would have seen Golan and Globus in breach of Hooper's contract. Instead, they removed him from the Spider-Man project. The company also disliked Hooper's tonal shift on the Texas Chainsaw sequel. This, coupled with the overspend on Invaders from Mars, signaled the imminent end of their collaboration. The director would later say, quote, "The problem with Spider-Man is that when I looked at it, I felt that we just did not have the money or technology to do it properly. We would occasionally speak about it, but after I did the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, I'd fulfilled my contract at Cannon, and they started to have their financial problems too. I love those guys though, and I wish we could have done Spider-Man." Stan Lee would whip up another outline and say that it was, quote, "pure quintessential Spider-Man. The plot was simple and linear. There was lots of room for good characterization and subplots. All the fun we used to have in the comic books themselves." Meanwhile, as all this had been happening, Up-and-coming writer Ted Newsom, a true comic book fan, scholar, film journalist, and cineast with an encyclopedic knowledge of Hammer horror movies, had asked his friend John Brancato if he wanted to help him work on a horror screenplay called Grandma's House. Brancato was bitten by the screenwriting bug, and the duo impressed the aforementioned Don Kopalov, who would introduce Stan Lee to the new talent, and they would collaborate on various Marvel projects. Newsom and Brancato were given the opportunity to pitch to Marvel and Canon. They kept it simple and said, "We'll adapt the comics. Everything you need is already right there." Their pitch was successful, and the pair then submitted a Spider-Man treatment based on Stan Lee's new outline. Newsom and Brancato added some depth and nuance to Lee's flimsy synopsis. The only instruction from Lee was his insistence that Dr. Octopus be the central villain, as opposed to the screenwriter's preference of using the Green Goblin. The duo worked with Stan Lee through the early phases, and Lee would push Canon to make the deal and hire them. Their treatment, featuring Doc Ock, was approved by Canon, and it immediately went to script stage. The pair at this junction assumed Hooper was attached as director, and would throw some visuals into the script that were considered Hooper-esque during the scenes when Dr. Octavius's experiments go awry. They wanted to write a modern, trippy take on the comic. There's an alteration to the classic origin in that the events surrounding Doc Ock's transformation are intertwined with Parker's spider bite. They also wanted to give Ock a more grounded motivation to his madness, rather than Lee's "he becomes a master criminal just because." Newsom would also tell journalist Ed Gross that, quote, "He's the antagonist, but if you sat down and asked him, he would not say he's doing bad things. His goals are absolutely pure as far as he's concerned. Most anybody, if you ask them, unless they're sociopaths, will tell you that their goals are pure. You have to have somebody like that as a villain if it's supposed to be anything else but white hat, black hat. We tried to keep the character human, despite the fact that he's an odd mutation." Joe Zito, the director of two of Canon's biggest hits, Missing in Action and Invasion USA, plus arguably one of the greatest slasher movies ever made, Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter, would ask Golan if he could work on Spider-Man. Zito was totally unaware of Hooper's fading link with the title at the time, and Golan, happy with the fact Zito's previous output for the company had turned into a healthy profit, would tell the director, "Sure, you've got your Spider-Man." The handover from Hooper to Zito would see a brief overlap of 24 hours when both names were in the frame. Canon's relationship with Hooper wasn't as strong as it once was, following a difference in opinion. Yoram Globus is then said to have dissuaded Hooper from any further participation in Spider-Man, and once Zito was officially attached, he would spend a year developing, visualizing, and scouting the film. Canon continued to push their promotional hype for Spider-Man. Along with trade ads and photos, those at Canon also received these exclusive Spider-Man jackets. Hope and expectations for a smash hit movie grew higher with each passing double-spread poster. Newsom and Brancato soon completed their screenplay, and in all honesty, they nailed it. The screenplay has been widely circulated online, and there's something quite timelessly perfect about it. It would have made for a great movie if Zito had been given the $20 million budget he was initially promised. Zito wanted to make art and break new ground. The director would talk to Cinefantastique magazine and say, quote, "I had made tough guy movies, but here was a hero who was a real guy, like you or me. Spider-Man had to face the very real problems we face in the real world. He wasn't just another tough guy from some other planet who has no conflict in this world. This was not a guy who had no problem distinguishing from right and wrong. Here's a guy, rather, who was always torn between having to go off and save the world and being at Aunt May's on time for dinner. That touches us in a real way. It taps into our fantasies, but grounds us in our realities." Zito would say that the story department were looking to push the dichotomy of Octavius and Spider-Man in a Batman, Joker, two sides of the same coin type of setup. But Zito's primary concern was on Parker's Spider-Man's journey from awkward teen to superhero. He said, quote, "At one point, there was a huge sense of urgency about this project. Suddenly, it had to be made yesterday. Now, Doc Ock was a wonderful villain, but this was getting away from what I thought the film was all about. I wanted to know what was happening dramatically inside of Spider-Man. His physical interaction with Dr. Octopus was, for me, the least interesting aspect of the picture." He initially wanted to do the movie at Elstree Studios, which Cannon had recently acquired. He says, quote, "I wanted the English set designers. I liked the quasi-surrealistic look they could give to the world I wanted to create for Spider-Man. It would have been a mistake to set Spidey in his red and blue outfit onto a brightly lit street in Santa Monica. I wanted his world to look slightly askew, sort of, with a quarter of a foot into the door of Brazil. I agreed with Stan Lee that Spider-Man's world had to be very real, but I also thought there had to be a sense that this was not a completely literal environment." The 40 acres were eventually reserved for Superman 4, and Zito was encouraged to scout locations in Italy at Cinecittà Studios. Zito hired 4 concept artists to board the entire script. The lead artist was the great Mentor Hübner, whose artwork lined the walls of the production office. Zito would speak of the high regard in which Hübner was held, saying, quote, "He's wonderful, an old-school pro and a real artist. His boards were inspiring to everyone. I could show them to anyone and they would understand the movie." Zito brought Marvel artist and concept art veteran Nikita Natz on board to convey the sense of Spider-Man's balletic composition. As he worked on figuring out the many practical effects and force perspectives the shoot would require, Zito says, quote, "We had to do things that had never been done before. Sets had to be built on angles. Spider-Man moves in ways unlike those of a stuntman on wires. I didn't want to see wires or use wires. I didn't want to use the conventional animation you see in cartoons. You can turn the TV on and see that stuff anytime. This had to be different and dazzling." Artist Harper Goff was hired as Zito continued to fill every inch of his office walls with giant frames of art as he visualized every single shot for the film. Artist Paul Power would sketch Parker and Octopus's battles upside the walls of New York, as the filmmakers tried to figure out the logistics of filming the stunts and effects practically, using matte paintings, old-school forced perspectives, and shifting sets. Talk of casting never really reached a stage where anyone was officially offered a role. Wish lists of suitable actors who visually matched the characters were drawn up. Zito says Stan Lee fancied himself as J. Jonah Jameson, and that actor Bob Hoskins, he felt, would have made a great Dr. Octopus, as he could picture him with Octavius's iconic bowl cut and goggles. Brancato had apparently seen the movie All the Right Moves, starring a young Tom Cruise, and commented on his resemblance to John Romita Sr.'s Peter Parker. Newsom had written the character of the Thorkel and Rosamov with the idea that Hammer icons Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing would be the perfect actors. There was also unsourced gossip from the time that Dolph Lundgren was being considered for a part. Menahem Golan was deeply enamored with the action star Michael Dudikoff of American Ninja fame, and would frequently tell the actor that he had him in mind to play both Spider-Man and Superman. Now, of course, talk is cheap. The filmmaking, however, isn't. To break down the beats of Newsom and Brancato's Spider-Man screenplay, we'll start on page 1, line 1. A single glistening strand of a spider's web bisects the frame. We see the strands crisscrossing others in a perfect orb web. A spider, black with an intricate pattern, gracefully gathers and weaves the strands together. We zoom out of the spider's web that forms in the corner of this experimental chamber. A 3-fingered mechanical claw thrusts into frame, followed by 3 more. The mechanical arms perform tasks as a chain-smoking Dr. Otto Octavius manipulates the controls. Octavius should be teaching classes at the university that employs him, but he instead has locked himself away in the basement experimenting on subatomic particles. His fellow colleagues are the bespectacled Alexander Thorkel and an elderly professor of astrophysics named Solomon Rosimov. As Octavius remains lost in his work, it's up to Rosimov to remind him, "You'll be late for class, Dr. Octavius. The university pays you to teach." Octavius respects Rosimov, but Thorkel is a man who simply irritates him. We meet a 20-year-old Peter Parker as he arrives at the Curtis Connors Science Center within the rundown Empire State University. Peter takes a seat at a lecture next to his awkward yet mischievous friend Harry Osborn and the popular and attractive Liz Allen. Peter and Liz engage in snappy back-and-forth banter before her boyfriend, the overbearing sports jock Flash Thompson, interrupts. Dr. Octavius, also known as Doc Ock, ambles in and teaches a class on Newtonian physics. After class, Peter watches Liz climb into Flash's sports car before speeding away. Peter seems to harbor a little unrequited love for Liz, but does his best to not show it. Peter later attempts to sell some photographs to the local down-market tabloid The Daily Bugle, and it's gruff, hard, if not impossible, to please editor J. Jonah Jameson. Jameson looks at Peter's work. Too artsy, too dumb, too hip. Jameson dismisses both Peter and his work, and sends him on his way with a reminder that blood, death, and sensationalism is what sells newspapers. Peter walks home. He lives in a downtrodden loft and his bills are overdue. It's a Friday evening in a run-down part of the city. Peter's Aunt May is waiting for him. She's brought him groceries and offers to take him home for dinner to cheer him up. Meanwhile, Doc Ock continues his experimentations. He claims he's solving the greatest physics problem of the 20th century. Thorkel, who's shutting down the project, tells him, "What you've done is make the entire physics department look foolish. You compare yourself to Einstein. Your colleagues compare you to Bozo the Clown." Doc Ock is quiet and seething. "This is the unified field," he says. "All the forces of the universe tied together perfectly." As the cyclotron is shut down, he bangs his fist on the door and yells. Peter watches a baseball game on TV with his Uncle Ben and Aunt May. They chat about baseball, share a pizza. Ben tells Peter how proud of him he is and that he's maybe considering retiring from work now that he's getting older. It's now late night, and Doc Ock breaks into the experimental chamber so he can continue his work on his cyclotron machine uninterrupted. The cyclotron whines. The beam erupts from the focuser onto the weight. Crawling on the crystal cone, we see a spider. The spider drops on a web strand toward the weight, which pulsates weirdly. A mechanical arm swipes at the spider. Sensing this, the spider drops. The machine overloads and explodes, melting the room into liquid. Ock looks down, fascinated. The extended metallic tentacles curl on the floor. We follow the length of one of them to its new source. It joins with Ock's torso. All 4 mechanical tentacles penetrate the flesh of Ock's bare chest and belly. He shrieks out as the room around him warps and folds in on itself in a glowing implosion. Police, fire, ambulance, and government officials from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission surround the area and evacuate the campus. Various news agencies race to the site. The official word is boiler explosion, but the press are talking about terrorism and nuclear meltdowns. Peter arrives on campus. Jameson spots him. He offers Peter some quick cash to take photos of the scene for the newspaper. Peter climbs a fence to sneak into the destroyed laboratory, twisting his ankle on the way over. He sees as various officials in radiation suits remove debris. The place is completely wrecked. Architectural angles are all skewed. Walls and doors that had previously melted are now re-solidified into new shapes. Peter remains hidden, clicks and takes pictures. Above his head, the still glowing spider drops from its twisted web on a strand. It lands unnoticed on his hand and bites down. Peter is hit by nausea as a security guard spots him and chases him away from the scene. Peter lifts his glasses to rub his eyes. The world comes into sharp, precise focus, and his ankle no longer hurts. Weird. It's almost like he has superpowers. An ambulance barrels down the road towards the lab. A woozy Peter jumps out of the way to avoid getting hit. The ambulance speeds on by. Peter is pressed against the bricks, eyes closed, breathing hard. He opens his eyes, regaining his senses. Puzzlement, then fear. He looks down. The sidewalk is 15 feet below him. He's clinging flat against the wall, palms at his sides against the bricks. Peter whimpers. A tremor in his hand. He reaches to pull himself upward, but the solid metal pipe crumbles in his hand like paper. He tries for a toehold. Brick crumbles beneath his feet. He swings wildly, but his fingertips hold him against the building's face. He looks at his fingers, his hand. The spider bite glows faintly under his skin. With growing confidence, he crawls the dizzying heights of the 10-story structure. He looks around himself, wondering if he's lost his mind. He sits down near the ledge. "This is very strange," he says. Confusion turns to elation. He leaps to the roof access door. New York stretches in every direction. The sun peeks out from behind the clouds. He runs at full speed across the roof. At the ledge, he leaps into space. He leaps and grabs the hook of a construction crane, swings on it like Tarzan. Peter tests his strength, imitating the martial arts of Bruce Lee. He later telephones the hospital. He speaks to the poison control department. "Hi," he says. "I've got sort of a hypothetical question. Do you suppose the bite of a radioactive spider would transmit that spider's proportional strength and agility? I suddenly have immense physical power and the ability to crawl up walls, you see." The nurse suggests he visits a psychiatrist and hangs up the call. Doc Ock is in the hospital care following his accident. We see horror on the face of the surgeons as they attempt to separate the melded organs from his flesh. Hydraulics and electronics are melded with tissue and bone. "Can't those things be removed somehow?" asks a nurse. "Not without killing him," replies the doctor. Back at the site of the lab explosion, strange occurrences continue. Solid surfaces remain elasticated. The damaged cyclotron is activated and a pulse of energy shoots outward and travels visibly along the power cables and out into the city's overhead wires. The pulse ripples through the power lines toward a commuter train. The commuter car whizzes forwards and vanishes into thin air. A second later, the train appears in a snow-covered wasteland in Mongolia. Back in New York, the rolling news reads, "Long Island train disappears." Perched atop the sign, high above it all, Peter scans the scene, arms folded. Looking down, he sees a cheesy theater sign. "Battle a monster! $1,000 for 1 minute with Hulk Hogan!" Contestants line up outside. Peter buys a novelty mask. Peter enters the competition. He bounds over the ropes onto the mat. Hogan looks down at the scrawny little contestant and mocks him. The large digital 1-minute clock buzzes down. Hogan grins and roars, lunging across the mat. Peter dodges the blonde giant, leaping and spinning aside acrobatically. The crowd boos, demanding action. Hogan goes for Peter again. This time, Peter overpowers the wrestler and defeats him. The clock ticks off the last few seconds. Peter celebrates as Hogan nurses his wounds. An entertainment agent hands Peter a business card. He wants him as a client on his roster of novelty acts. High on confidence, Peter goes to visit Liz at her dorm. He learns that she's away on a short trip with Flash, and so now Peter is back to feeling miserable. Back at the hospital, Thorkel delivers the news to Dr. Octavius that while he won't be charged for breaking and entering, or the matter of the total destruction of a $23 million cyclotron, he has been fired from the university and his work is forever terminated. Ock tells him he will finish his work. A tentacle reaches out and grabs Thorkel by the throat. Ock smirks, and the tentacle crushes the man. Ock stands over the body. An arm telescopes outward. The claw opens and shuts experimentally. Ock nods in growing pleasure. Another arm draws the curtains. A third arm shoots out and clicks the door locked. The fourth arm delicately clicks off the electronic monitors. Ock clenches and relaxes his human hands. The mechanical arms writhe like cobras. He smiles. One mechanical arm sneaks into a nearby changing room. It collects a doctor's white jacket and a green and yellow jogging suit. We then see the doc stand before a medical incinerator. A mechanical arm tosses Thorkel's glasses into the flames. Another tentacle closes the grate. Back at his apartment, Peter goes through a series of experiments. Through a process of trial and error, he manufactures a web fluid shooter he can place in the palm of his hand. Peter has now settled upon the name Spider-Man. He sets his camera to auto time and poses for a series of shots. His buddy, Harry, meanwhile, has been suspended from classes and has lost his scholarship after one too many pranks. Harry drops by Peter's apartment, drunk and full of sorrow. Peter helps his buddy as he vomits across the hallway. Doc Ock returns to the university campus. He attempts to restart the cyclotron. As he does, electrical appliances all over the city start to explode, and manhole covers flip into the air. Ock backs away from the sizzling control panel. A mechanical arm throws a switch to shut the cyclotron down. Disgusted, he storms out. He heads to an Electrodyne factory. He picks out items: pipes, wires, transformers, accelerator rails, copper components. The salesman laughs. What are you building, an atomic bomb? Ock stares forward. Ock isn't laughing. The bill comes to $170,000. Ock frowns. The salesman's a little nervous. You have to pay for it, he says. The bulge under Ock's coat moves ominously. His face darkens. He's about to kill the salesman, then notices there are too many witnesses about. Ock realizes he needs money. Lots of it, and fast. He turns on his heel and strides away. Peter takes his pictures of Spider-Man to Jameson. Jameson takes one glance at the image, deems it useless, tears it in half, tosses it into the wastebasket, and sends him on his way with the words, "I can't print this surreal garbage." Peter's next call is to the agent who gave him the business card. "I'm the guy who wrestled Hulk Hogan the other night," he says. The agent is pleased to hear from him and books him on that evening's Late Show with David Letterman. All classes have been canceled until further notice, leaving Peter with a free afternoon. He joins in with Flash's basketball game. Flash is his usual bully self, until Peter flips him to the concrete and shocks the players by leaping up and holding onto the backboard before slam-dunking the ball through the hoop. Peter sees Liz in the cafeteria. He makes a few snidey remarks about her weekend away with Flash, unintentionally upsetting her. Peter then stops by the office of Professor Rossimoff. It's an old space filled with star charts and an ancient sextant, books, a telescope, a large revolving model of the solar system, an antique spinning wheel, and a harpsichord. The room is odd, but inviting. Rossimoff is studying a map of New York City. In particular, the incidents where people's electrical appliances basically attacked their owners, and the area where a train was transported from the subway to Mongolia. Peter picks up one of the news clippings. "Wall crawler spotted across New York." Rossimoff looks up and says, "Fortean phenomena. Anomalies in our so-called reality. Weirdness, my boy, and lots of it." We then cut away to the National Bank as a uniformed guard collects a pickup. He slams the doors of an armored truck and then climbs into the cab. The driver revs the motor. It's not moving. The guard unsnaps his holster. Without warning, two mechanical tentacles smash through the thick glass on both sides. We see Doc Ock. He holds the truck aloft by the rear bumper. The rear wheels spin. Two other tentacles surround the truck, squirming into the cab. Gunshots and screams echo around the area as a fourth mechanical arm tears open the rear door and grabs several money bags. Back at the university, Rosamov enlists the help of Harry, who's looking to get back into his professor's good books. They study a graphic of the solar system. It zooms in toward the Earth, then further until there's an aerial view of northeastern America. Harry can see where several pulses of activity caused by Ock's experiments have lit up the map. The pulses are multiplying and coalescing. A blue funnel forms over New York. It grows and intensifies. Harry maps out the activity. He turns to Rosamov and explains, an energy vacuum, sucking power into itself. If it gets enough juice, we go into a chain reaction. The Big Bang, but in reverse. The end of the universe. This will make one hell of a video game. Rosamov's face registers growing dread. Spider-Man now makes his first public appearance. He hitches a ride on the back of a subway train and emerges outside Rockefeller Plaza. Members of the public think the circus is in town. Spider-Man nervously awaits backstage before his television appearance. He hears Letterman introduce him. For arachnid lovers everywhere, here is the amazing Spider-Man. How about a tacit round of applause? Peter emerges from behind a curtain. The audience is a little confused. Letterman shakes his hand. Gonna get you a snack? A housefly, maybe? Peter then runs through a series of acrobatic feats and somersaults. He swings on webs above the audience. See? I also have this amazing strength, he says before lifting Letterman's desk with one hand. The audience applauds wildly. Peter gets his check and enjoys the adulation, until suddenly he gets a very bad feeling. This is his first experience of spider sense, a warning of danger. He doesn't know what it means, but he knows something's wrong. He sees distorted imagery, of broken glass, his Uncle Ben. Peter phones home. Ben seems to be all right. He tells him to be sure to watch the Letterman show. As Peter and Ben chat, behind him, a store owner chases a thief down the street. "Stop him!" he cries out. "Somebody stop him!" The thief dodges cars and buses. He runs past Peter and disappears down the subway. The store owner stops by. "You could have stopped him," he angrily tells Peter. "You could have stuck your leg out, tripped him, anything." "Oh, give me a break," replies Peter. "Do I look like Charles Bronson?" Peter, still in the Spider-Man costume, goes to a disco. He puts on a fabulous show of acrobatic breakdancing. The crowd is into it. In mid-move, Spider-Man freezes, the tingle of his spider sense again. He hears distorted sounds of gunshots, a man's groan. The crowd urges Spider-Man to continue, but he pushes through them and leaves. He jumps into a cab. The cab drives on. Peter looks out of the window and sees that bizarre electrical pulses are radiating throughout the city. The plaza's sculpture has become a huge magnet. In quick succession, every small metallic object in the area sails in from all directions. Car keys, belt buckles, jewelry, even shopping carts. They all fly toward the sculpture and stick magnetically. The throb and pulse abruptly cease. The objects clatter to the plaza pavement. Peter finally arrives at Aunt May's house. The area is a crime scene. Uniformed beat cops hold bystanders at distance as the lieutenant investigates. Peter learns that his Uncle Ben has been shot in a burglary and has been taken to the hospital. He jumps back in the cab and goes straight to the hospital. Aunt May sits in a sterile, lonely waiting room. Peter arrives. From the other side of the waiting room, a grim-faced doctor crosses slowly toward them. "Mrs. Parker," he says, "I'm sorry. We tried." Peter overhears a uniformed cop say that the police has the gunman surrounded at a warehouse over on 112th. Playing in the background on the TV in the waiting room is the Letterman Spider-Man segment. Up on the screen is Spider-Man. "See, I also have this amazing strength." Peter races out into the night. We cut away to the warehouse. Searchlights, SWAT teams, snipers. The place is surrounded on all angles. Spider-Man clings to a wall facing the warehouse. He shoots a long web up to the warehouse roof, loops the strand around his hand, and swings high above the stunned police. Reporters try to catch him on film as he arcs across the street to the warehouse. Spider-Man crashes through a window. The gunman, only half visible in the dim, smoky light, whirls and fires again at Spider-Man. Spider-Man leaps down. His boot connects with the man's jaw. Spider-Man pulls his mask off and stands above the unconscious gunman. He hesitates and sees the face of the gunman. We flash back to Spider-Man on the phone. The thief rushes toward him and we freeze frame on his face. The thief and the gunman are the same man. Police rush in, guns drawn. Silence, but for the crackle of flames and bursting of paint cans. Through the smoke, they see something large hanging from the rafters like a yo-yo. It's the gunman, moaning, completely enveloped in webbing. Dawn starts to break over Manhattan. We see Spider-Man sitting alone on the peak of a marble facade. He tears off the mask. Peter's eyes are red-rimmed, past tears. He pulls the check from his waistband, stares at it, then slowly rips it into small pieces. He stands, watching the confetti-like bits flutter downward, then violently rips the tunic from his chest. He pauses. We see the web shooter still taped to his arms. Peter throws the mask, gloves, and tunic down toward the street. The blue and red costume drifts in the wind past an engraved motto. With great power comes great responsibility. Doc Ock returns to the Electrodyne factory with a huge wad of crisp bills. He buys up everything he can, and before the salesman even has a chance to take his details, Ock climbs into the company's flatbed truck and drives away with his supplies. Peter sees the day's headlines. The lead story on page 1 of the Daily Bugle relays a story accusing Spider-Man of crimes against the city of New York, of being in cahoots with the arrested killer. Peter's photo of Spider-Man, with a barely perceptible, taped-together rip down the middle, accompanies the headlines. Spider-Man is the talk of the university campus after his Letterman appearance. Liz thinks he's silly and obnoxious, whereas Flash is full of defense and admiration for the masked man. They see that the photo credit belongs to Peter Parker. "You know this guy?" asks Flash. "Who is he? Where did he come from? He's a cop? Martial arts freak?" Peter replies, "He's a mistake," and walks away. By now, the charred remains of the murdered Thorkel have been discovered. The lieutenant questions Rossimoff, tells him Dr. Octavius is suspected of stealing an armored truck and killing 2 men with his mechanical arms. "Octavius wasn't the murderer type," counters Rossimoff. He tells the cop of the bizarre events all over the city, that there's an infinitely greater danger at play. "Listen," says Rossimoff, "the only thing Octavius cares about is repeating his experiment. To do that, he needs a radioactive catalyst. He'll need a cyclotron. He can't use ours, he's already destroyed ours. Guard every nuclear accelerator on the eastern seaboard." "You sure about this?" asked the lieutenant. Rossimoff hands him a list of nuclear sites. "I know him," he says. As the cop leaves, Peter enters, asking for an extension on his paper. Rossimoff shows Peter the Daily Bugle. "This photo you took of Spider-Man," he says. "Right place, right time," says Peter. "I don't think I'll be running into him again." "You never know," says Rossimoff. "I'd like to speak with him." Peter looks at him. "I'll try. Thanks," and leaves. Peter returns home and collects the costume. He plans to return to the store he bought it from. Peter's agent is on the phone, pestering. Peter tells him Spider-Man is no more, and hangs up. The phone rings again. It's J. Jonah Jameson. "Parker, I love you. We scooped every paper in the country on this Spider-Man jerk. I want more, Parker, I want more. Get pictures of him robbing a bank or kicking a dog, anything." Peter hangs up the phone. He isn't in the mood. Jameson is left holding a dead receiver. "Parker? Parker? Ha! What a newsman! On the job already! We cut away to an electrical substation, where we see Doc Ock frantically working away. Sparks fill the air. All 4 of Ock's arms work at once. Ock's eyes frenetically scan a series of voltmeters. One registers escalating levels, while others jump, then drop. Armed security guards arrive at the substation. They approach Ock from behind. Without turning around, Ock extends his mechanical arms, taking on all the guards and squeezing the life out of them. Bullets ricochet all around. Ock's attention returns to his work. A female guard reaches out for a fallen gun, but her body is dragged away from the weapon by the ankles. Liz comforts Peter, who's struggling to come to terms with the events of the past few days. Liz seems to be making sense and getting through when Peter zones out. It's his spider sense. He hears the panic cries of people in a subway car. He can hear the distant sounds of Doc Ock. "Hello?" says Liz. "Earth to Peter Parker?" Peter isn't paying attention. He remembers he still has the costume in his bag. He gets up and walks out without saying a word. We cut to the office district of Wall Street. Cars are swerving, spinning around the road, smashing together as a magnetic pulse throbs from beneath the pavement. The roads begin to ripple, and vehicles start to sink into the liquefying ground. It's like quicksand. Cabs are swallowed into the nothingness. Spider-Man swings to the edge of an overlooking building. He watches the cars sink. There's an earthquake-like rumble from below as a subway 3-car train bursts up through the ground and sails through the air past Spider-Man. A huge hole opens like an iris in the facade of a nearby modern office building. The train thrusts into the shimmering hole, which clamps shut around it, leaving the remaining train carriage dangling vertically from a skyscraper. The passengers scream out for help. Spider-Man shoots a long stream of webbing and swings to the glass front building. He climbs the train and pops his head through an open window. "Hello," he says. The passengers stare as he climbs in, backs them away from the glass wall. The thick iron links between the carriages begin to perilously buckle and bend under the strain. Spider-Man has 2 people left to save. A fire truck extends its ladder up the side of the building. Spider-Man lifts each passenger to safety. He rescues the last couple of passengers by wrapping them in webs and swinging them like pendulums to safety, just as the subway cars rip away from each other and crash to the ground. Reporters and onlookers applaud and celebrate this mysterious superhero. Spider-Man swings from skyscraper to skyscraper, reeling like a roller coaster through the concrete canyons. He spots Doc Ock driving below. Ock's truck runs out of gas. He abandons it and walks down the road, oblivious to the chaos he's created. A mechanical arm extends and rips the driver's door off a Cadillac. He slides in as the car owner scrambles out of the other side in fear. Cadillac speeds away through red lights. It mounts the pavement and scatters panicked pedestrians in all directions. Spider-Man swoops down in pursuit. He lands on the overpass. Ock's car recedes out of sight. There are no buildings to swing from, no vehicles to cling to. It starts to rain. Spider-Man sighs and starts walking. We cut away to a toxic waste dump. We see a police car with 2 gaping holes in the windshield and 2 dead patrolmen inside. We see Doc Ock. It's a nightmarish industrial landscape. Giant vats overflowing with rancid chemicals. In an open concrete bunker, Ock uses his human hands to pull open a vault-like drawer. Inside are dozens of sealed canisters, all bearing danger, radioactivity warnings. He checks through them, discarding unwanted canisters haphazardly. Spider-Man swings into frame. "Open that now and you'll spoil Christmas," he laughs. Ock whirls around. Spider-Man drops down from atop a chemical vat. "Surprise," says Spider-Man. Ock pulls open his overcoat. "Surprise," he quietly replies as all four mechanical arms telescope toward the astonished Spider-Man. They encircle his body, squeezing like pythons. Spider-Man gulps for air, struggling desperately against the steel arms. He wriggles a hand free, shoots webbing up, and pulls himself from Ock's clutches. Ock grabs the small canister, but a stream of webbing shoots down and jerks the container up to Spider-Man on the roof of the bunker. He springs down to the ground on the run. Ock's arms lift an oil drum and hurls it over his head. The drum bursts ahead of Spider-Man, spraying a greasy cloud of nauseous gas and sizzling liquid. Spider-Man leaps and grabs Ock in a headlock. Two mechanical arms grip Spider-Man and fling him into the distance. Metal fists begin to aim deadly blows. Then, Professor Rosamoff appears. "Octavius!" he shouts. The wild violence drains from Ock's face, replaced for a moment by sanity. He looks at Rosamoff, then at the metal arms, then again at Rosamoff, pitifully. With an anguished cry, he loosens the grip on the choking Spider-Man. Ock rushes to the Cadillac, drives off. Sirens wail in the distance as Rosamoff helps Spider-Man to his feet and drives him away. Rosamoff explains to Peter that Octavius has developed a messianic complex and plans to blow up the world just to prove he's right. Peter returns to his apartment and falls asleep. The lights in his building cut out. We see the New York skyline. Lighted buildings flash dark in clusters. Peter bolts upright. He senses screams, explosions, the end of the world. He straps on a set of web shooters, gloves, mask, and leaps out of the room. The streets of New York are now overrun with looters, chaos, and anarchy reigns due to the power outage. Spider-Man webs up the looters before swinging toward the miles-wide illumination of Ock's experimental chamber. Inside the Curtis Connors Science Center, Ock works. He's lost in his mad rapture. All his arms work at top speed. Rosamoff tries to connect with him from the control room. "Otto, you have to hear me," he says. "The world we know will collapse. Everything we've devoted our lives to, all patterns, all harmonies will be destroyed. You have no right. This is cosmic suicide." Spider-Man appears. He leaps onto Octavius and kicks him in the chest, knocking him backward into a pile of gas tanks and chemicals. "Spider-Man, be careful, he's quite mad," says Rosamoff. "I'm not so happy myself," replies Spider-Man. Without warning, an arm springs out and wallops Spider-Man in the head. The blow sends him flying. He falls on the floor in a heap, unconscious. Harry and Liz arrive at the Science Center looking for Peter and the professor. The floors begin to crack open. The brick walls slide away and rise upwards. The sidewalk buckles. Trees uproot and fall over. Inside the chamber, Rosamoff drags the unconscious Spider-Man to safety as the entire building rises upward and hovers in the air like a brick spaceship. In rapid succession, power stations around the city explode and shoot rivers of electricity toward the building ascending in the distance. Twisting, rope-like beams crack through the sky, ripping holes through skyscrapers in their path. An energy cyclone erupts and whirls beneath the rising structure, sucking objects from the street. Tin cans, bus benches, trees, newsstands, parked cars. All swirl in the inverted funnel growing beneath the building. Spider-Man wakes up. He leaps around the energy streams to catch Ock's attention. Ock is intensely absorbed in the experiment's progress. Spider-Man hurls a fuel tank at Ock, who deflects it. An energy bolt hits it and the tank explodes, tearing a door-sized hole in the floor behind Spider-Man. Ock tells Spider-Man, "You annoy me." His arms lunge for him. Spider-Man ducks, dodges, and jumps through the hole in the floor. Ock falls after him. The building hovers and pitches unstably in midair. Spider-Man rips loose a drain pipe to defend himself against Ock's arms. A bizarre sword duel ensues, a 10-foot pipe versus 4 metal tentacles. As the building spins skyward, Liz falls through an open window. Spider-Man turns. He shoots webbing to secure her to the face of the building. He scrambles down and pulls her to safety. "This building is flying," she says. "I'm in a flying building." Rosamov works frantically in the control room, trying to reverse Ock's experiment. "Magnetism phase 1, he tells Spider-Man. "We're returning to normal." Ock's mechanical arms erupt through the floor. Seething, he pulls himself into the room, loose strands of webbing hanging from his face and arms. "Oh, come on," says an exasperated Spider-Man. Spider-Man leaps to the ceiling above the cyclotron. Ock strikes out. The magnetism sucks an arm against the accelerator tube and holds it fast. Ock's remaining arms strike madly at Spider-Man, Rosamov, Liz, everything, until a beam of energy travels up Ock's mechanical arm and bursts it apart. Wires and metal scatter as the tentacle hangs limply. Ock still has 2 tentacles left. The 2 remaining arms thrust madly at Spider-Man, who ducks, causing Ock to accidentally smash through his machine. The fibrous blue-white beam envelops Doc Ock's entire body. A dark, completely alien slit opens in space where the focusing cone had been. The widening gap draws Ock into its weird beyond. He reaches toward it with his human hands. Liz and Spider-Man struggle to resist the gap's pull. Rosamov watches in horror as Ock's body warps, twists inside itself. He howls, agony, pleasure, enlightenment, then death. The gap implodes Doc Ock's body and disappears, closing and sucking the last of the energy and pulse into it. The building begins a rapid free fall toward the ground. Central Park accelerates toward them as they plunge to Earth. The Science Center disintegrates on impact with Central Park Lake. Falling, with Liz hanging onto his neck, Rosamov under one arm, Spider-Man shoots webbing downward and swings gracefully amidst a hailstorm of debris. Papers, books, bottles, bricks. The lake's surface churns and calms. The trio stands for a moment, stunned. Liz's knees buckle as she faints. Spider-Man catches her. All is well. We cut away to days later. Rosamov gives Peter a good grade on his paper. "Peter, I'm so very proud of you," he says. "I must apologize for doubting that you could do it." Peter eyes him, wondering what he knows. Rosamov eyes him back. Spider-Man is now the hero of the front pages. He's Flash's new idol and the talk of the whole city. Peter meets Liz in the park. They exchange a few words before Peter kisses her. She kisses him back, and they walk off into the park holding hands. And we fade out to black. The end. Upon reading the Newsom Brancato screenplay, Marvel chief James E. Galton would write to Globus and say, quote, "The Spider-Man script, in my opinion, is superb. It maintains the basic integrity of the character in the original story while placing it in a modern setting. It's simple and direct in its plot line and very easy for the reader to follow. I've now read approximately 12 Spider-Man scripts or treatments, and this is by far the best of the lot." Zito had wanted to work with Newsom and Brancato on the screenplay, or at least get a chance to look at the thing since he was the director, but Brancato didn't want to. Newsom was caught somewhere in the middle, and Zito's hand was effectively forced into hiring a more cooperative and friendlier face. Zito hired Barney Cohen to redraft the existing screenplay. Cohen had already written the final chapter for Zito, and so the screenwriter was flown out to Los Angeles from New York for 3 months of work. Cohen would familiarize himself with the character by surrounding himself with as many Spider-Man comics as possible. Cohen says, he realized Golan still didn't understand the character's duality. Cohen says, quote, "What I mean by duality is that he would rescue somebody, and then garbage would fall on his head. Then he couldn't get a date, and things like that. Menahem went nuts when he saw my first draft because he thought I was doing exactly the opposite of that. He really saw Spider-Man as a young Superman in a different outfit. I don't know if Menahem would know Superman as a socialist, realist hero, which he was. He just did not get the duality. It was very difficult to explain to him why Spidey is self-deprecating, why garbage falls on his head, why he swings on a web and lands on the wrong thing. He just didn't get it. That wouldn't happen to Superman. Finally, Zito, who did get it, convinced him, and we ended up with a pretty good script." As Cohen tells it, quote, "At that point, stars and funders would come by this particular office we were working out of because Spider-Man was the $20 million movie. This was a major motion picture. We were like a stop on the tour. We were credible." The interesting thing is that most of these people would come by because they were interested in Spider-Man, and they all knew the character better than I did. To be honest, though, the whole experience was just a lot of fun. But then, Menahem told Joe that he had to lower the budget. Cohen's rewrite would create a sidekick named Wiener for Dr. Octavius, who assists him with his crimes and is responsible for the death of Uncle Ben. Cohen's work would also adopt more of a sillier, fun-for-all-the-family, kid-friendly tone. Scott Leva was an actor and stuntman who had done lots of commercial and promotional work as Spider-Man at Marvel-themed events and conventions. Leva had already met Lee a couple times in character. He was capable of amazing flexibility and acrobatic gymnastic stunts when in costume. The famous print of Stan Lee and Spider-Man facing each other, the one that held the pride of place on the wall of Lee's office, that was Leva inside the suit. Also, this iconic photo shoot featuring Leva in costume was taken by Elliot R. Brown on the 10th floor of Marvel offices, and would go on to provide the cover of Amazing Spider-Man issue 262. While this photo shoot was separate to any film development, Leva did have a series of test shots taken that show his on-camera suitability, not only as Spider-Man, but as Peter Parker, too. Leva had done the promotional work for Canon's Spider-Man's posters and ads. Jim Shooter had first noted Leva's physical resemblance to Peter Parker, as would Stan Lee. As the project passed from Hooper to Zito, Leva would push to get a foot in the door. While no actor was ever officially approached, it's more than likely that Leva would have been the star of Canon and Zito's Spider-Man. During a temporary hold on the production, Leva and a friend would write a Spider-Man script on spec, featuring the origin stories of Spider-Man and Dr. Octopus. The screenplay is available online to read, and is a solid would-be first movie that is clearly written by someone with a true affinity for the character and his comic book world. Menahem Golan, meanwhile, had taken a shot at rewriting the second screenplay under his pen name Joseph Goldman. Stan Lee wasn't as pleased with the Barney Cohen draft as he was with the Newsom Brancato draft. He said it wasn't as good as the original, and would say of the Goldman rewrite that, quote, "The scripts kept getting worse and worse. And finally, I got a call I'll never forget. It was from Menahem Golan, who was in Europe. He said I shouldn't worry, because he was going to rewrite the script on the plane heading back to California." The Joseph Goldman editions never added anything substantial to the screenplay, and his minor contributions only served to further bring down the quality of dialogue and story as he chipped away at the charm and perfect structure of the original. Zito would later say that although Golan was prone to experimenting with rewrites, he was never wedded to his ideas and was willing to throw them out if told that they wouldn't work. Golan and Globus were now shooting 20-plus movies a year and were reporting a $15 million profit on revenues of $150 million. The pair embarked on a spending spree that included a $270 million acquisition of Screen Entertainment, formerly Thorn EMI, comprising a major British movie theater chain and a London movie studio with a large film library of over 2,000 titles. They then licensed its British film library for European distribution in television and home video in deals that was valued at over $150 million. Despite all the cash the company had raised, it disclosed publicly that its working capital, the funds available for acquisitions and new film productions, had decreased to a negative $105.5 million, down from a positive $32.7 million just 1 year earlier. These figures, to anyone who dabbles in accounting, would appear to raise alarm, but not to Golan. Golan wasn't fazed by the fact that prior to buying the cinema screens, the company had a balance of $300 million, and afterwards they were down to $30 million. He didn't mind, because he had big plans to compete with the Hollywood studio system. Asked in an interview at the time if the company had cash flow problems, Globus said, "We don't have any problem." Unfortunately, he did have a problem. The gamble didn't pay off. They had stretched themselves too thin. The flawed business model of relying upon the revenue of as-yet unmade films to fund further ventures was starting to crumble. Cannon Films' own stockholders filed a class action lawsuit against the cousins, accusing them of being deceptive when it came to their accounting. The stockholders later settled for $33 million. Cannon then disclosed that the Securities and Exchange Commission had begun their informal inquiry into the company accounts for its budgeting and public filing. There was a formal investigation of all Cannon's public disclosures since 1983. Cannon's stock eventually plunged on the New York Stock Exchange, and then the banks encouraged Cannon to file for bankruptcy. Zito tells Ed Gross that, quote, "I got another call when they were going through even more difficulties with banks and that kind of thing. They asked me to come back to Los Angeles from Rome. I went to Golan's home. There, I met with Golan, Globus, and the head of production. Globus said, 'I have $10 million for your Spider-Man.' I said, $10 million? Look, we've got a $5 million effects budget. You're kidding yourself. You can't make this movie for $10 million. If that's all you can spend, you ought to not make this film. $10 million is a lot of money, and you could have made a real good film for that amount of money. Maybe 2 really good films. But not Spider-Man, with the level of effects you would need to make it competitive as an A-level film that you're going to base the value of a company on. So I advised them not to do it, and that's how we didn't do it. But they would always say that they should have made Spider-Man because it was going to be their Batman. It was the film that was going to change the value of the company. Unfortunately, it came at a time when they could not afford to make it. Had we gotten the thing off the ground 6 months earlier, we would have made the film, and it would have changed canon. The film we had in mind was a film that would have worked. Spider-Man's budget had been allocated to the company's other 2 newly acquired, potentially lucrative properties. At the Cannes Film Festival, the cousins purchased the rights for Superman from Alexander and Ilya Salkind. The first 3 Superman movies were Warner Brothers productions, which the Salkinds had produced. According to the LA Times, who printed the news in 1987, the deal was worth $5 million. Warner Brothers would distribute this film as part of a cash deal that bailed Cannon out of trouble the previous year. In the rush to get the wheels turning on Superman 4: The Quest for Peace, Golan and Globus had offered a $5 million salary to Reeve to star in Part 4. As part of the agreement, Cannon would fund Reeve's pet project Street Smart for $7 million. Reeve was also promised a story by credit and given significant input into the script, and allowed to direct the second unit action. Golan had often stated that he felt Star Wars was the greatest masterpiece ever filmed, and he wanted Cannon to put out a Star Wars of their own. Unfortunately, Cannon were running out of money and lines of credit fast. Despite this, several days after buying the rights from the Salkinds, Golan and Globus would run into film reps from Mattel. The cousins may not have entered the conversation knowing much about He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, but they left it with a contract for the rights and the commitment to release a big-budget movie based on the popular toy line and cartoon. Producer Edward Pressman owned the film rights to Masters of the Universe, and the script had been budgeted at $22 million. Pressman Films had been set to produce the film previously with Warner Brothers, But Warner's didn't want to spend a penny over $15 million. Pressman hooked up with Cannon, who immediately agreed to outlay $17.5 million. After Richard Donner declined to return for Superman 4, Reeves' next choice, Ron Howard, was unable to commit. And so Cannon hired horror icon Wes Craven to direct. Unfortunately, Reeve and Craven's ideas never synced up, and Craven was replaced. There's no doubt that Cannon were the architects of their inevitable demise. The misappropriation of funds was some severely poor management, and by now they were up to $100 million in debt. Hoped-for profits from other Cannon movies had never materialized. The lack of planning and preparation would lead to a series of problems with the special effects departments, with multiple rewrites, extensions. As the costs went up, the budgets went down. Not only did the company have money from all the pre-sale video and cable rights to many as-then unmade movies, sold on the strength of a poster or improvised pitch to foreign investors, but Warner Brothers had funded $36 million towards Superman 4. Cannon only funneled $17 million of it toward the production of The Quest for Peace, and divided the other $19 million up between another 30 Cannon titles. A supposed 50-50 deal on splitting costs between Cannon and Mattel would lead to issues when it came to deciding whose turn it was to pay, and neither felt it was theirs. Superman's finances were slashed from an agreed-upon $30 million to $13 million. Spider-Man's budget, meanwhile, tumbled from $18 million to $10 to $4.5 to maybe just over $1 million. But still, even though the walls were crashing down around them, and children were left wondering, where's Battlecat? Where's Orko? What's the cosmic key? Cannon pushed for a Master of the Universe sequel. The Spider-Man budget was asked to be slashed by up to 75%. Feeling compromised and in an impossible situation, Zito left the project that he'd prepped and dedicated a year of his life to. After Zito left the project, he was replaced, out of haste and necessity, by Albert Pyun in the spring of 1987. Pyun had caught Cannon's attention with his film Radioactive Dreams in 1985. He would then make Dangerously Close and Down Twisted in 1987, followed by Alien from LA the following year. Pyun agreed to direct Spider-Man and the He-Man sequel simultaneously, staggering the production dates to accommodate both schedules. Pyun said that he was hired to direct Spider-Man, and working with writer Shepard Goldman on the screenplay, he says that his movie would have featured the classic origin of Peter Parker's Spider-Man, that it would have featured Dr. Curt Connors, aka the Lizard, as the villain of the piece, and that using the Lizard would save costs by allowing most of the fights and chase scenes to take place in the sewers of Brooklyn. I'm not sure if Pyun ever did write a screenplay featuring the Lizard as the villain, because the screenplay with Goldman, one that was revised 10 times across the December of 1987, doesn't feature Curt Connors or the Lizard at all. Instead, titled The Amazing Spider-Man, the Goldman-Pyun screenplay opens in a high school science class, where we see grade-A student Peter Parker receive a 100% exam pass, while the rest of the class fails. Peter is selected to represent the high school at the upcoming Era of Tomorrow Science Fair. It's a competition which will award first place with a scholarship to a university. We cut to the gymnasium, where dim quarterback Flash Thompson slams a ball into Peter's head. Peter's best friend is the skeptical Harry Osborn, and we learn that Peter has a secret crush on the popular cheerleader Liz Allen, who happens to be Flash's girlfriend. Peter is also friends with a shy girl named Gwendolyn. Across the city, a gang of troublemakers steal from a store. The members are introduced as the following, quote, "The leader is Knight, a genuine delinquent on the brink. His cohorts, Rico and Dee, tag along for the ride. All products of the frustration born from being trapped in the economic depression of the era. The group is a wash of leather, chains, tattoos, feathers, studs, and spurs." We cut to Uncle Ben and Aunt May's garage. Ben makes lewd jokes and enthusiastically watches wrestling on TV. A fighter named Crusher Hogan throws his opponent around the ring. Peter works away on a device that he's building for the science fair. Uncle Ben takes a phone call from the bank. Peter senses he and May are having financial troubles. The next day at school, Peter gets another basketball launched at his head by Flash Thompson. Peter walks home with the school's 18-year-old janitor, Ralph, a one-time science student full of potential, but had to drop out to help his mom. As the two walk through a shady part of the city, they see Knight, Dee, and Rico mugging a young couple at knife point. Ralph tries to help, but he's punched in the face, and the trio lay into him with fists and kicks. Peter picks up a trash can and smashes it over Knight's back. Ralph and Peter take off running. The punks give chase. Peter eventually arrives back home. Uncle Ben is watching a commercial advertising a televised wrestling challenge where members of the public are offered $1,000 to last one round in the ring with Crusher Hogan. Peter and Ben watch the ad and dream about the problems the prize money would solve. Peter notices something out of the corner of his eye. Through the window, he sees Knight, Dee, and Rico. The three thugs point at Peter and run away laughing. The next day, it's the science fair. As various students ready their inventions for competition, we see Harry help Peter backstage. The crowd is introduced to Dr. Tanner, a mustached, bald-headed man in a white smock who's the event's judge. As Peter approaches the stage, we learn that Flash has messed with the device because he wants the school to lose. He laughs about his act of sabotage to Liz. Peter fixes it and shows off his bug cam, a flying tiny drone that zips around the room taking photographs. Peter's invention wins first place, and Dr. Tanner awards him the 4-year scholarship and trophy. The next day, Dr. Tanner takes Peter on a tour of his company, General Technotronic Laboratories. Peter is shown the lab's work on laser and radiation control and atomic science. Tanner shows Peter an experiment that manipulates the control of radioactive rays. From above their heads, a tiny spider descends from the ceiling on a strand of webbing. The rays from Tanner's device zap the spider with a beam of light. It drops onto Peter's hand and bites him. The experiment stops and the demonstration is over. Peter feels strange and goes outside for some fresh air. He looks at his hand. The bite mark pulsates. His muscles start to fill out. He feels dizzy and starts to stumble out onto the road, just as Knight and his gang are screeching toward him in a car. Knight tries to run Peter over, but Peter leaps high into the air and sticks to the wall. He walks up the wall effortlessly. He tries all sorts of stunts and acrobatics as he tests and enjoys his newfound powers. Through a nearby window, he sees the Crusher Hogan TV commercial advertising the as-yet unclaimed $1,000 prize. Peter goes straight home. He's unsure how long his spider power will last, and so decides to enter the wrestling competition. We meet Crusher Hogan and his agent Maxie. Crusher is getting a massage. The wrestler is worried about getting old and permanently injured, but his agent is trying to convince him to stay on to continue touring from city to city, earning prize money. As Crusher defeats contestants in the ring, Peter stands up. His face and head is covered in netted fabric that hides his identity. "I'll try that for $1,000, he yells. Peter enters the ring and defeats Crusher easily and without even breaking a sweat. Maxie introduces himself to Peter as a manager, talent scout, agent, and producer, and promises Peter that his act could earn them a fortune. Peter returns home, and using his knowledge of chemistry and micromechanics, builds web shooters that he attaches to bracelets on his wrists. As he looks for material to make a costume, he finds a letter from the bank to Uncle Ben and Aunt May, scheduling a foreclosure date on their home due to missed payments. Peter decides to cash in on his powers any way he can. The next day at school, Peter's new physique has everyone staring open-mouthed at his muscles. Peter is cocky and confident as he greets Harry, Liz, and Flash. During a game of volleyball, Peter scores one goal after another. He's showing off and bides his time until he sees Flash. Then, pow! The ball hits Flash in the head and sends him flying, unconscious. Peter laughs. He feels powerful. His friends are starting to look at him a little fearfully now. Peter visits Maxie's office. He's picked the name Spider-Man for his act. Peter now does what Crusher Hogan used to do, televised fights with contenders. Spider-Man tours and defeats all who enter the ring. He lives in a chauffeur-driven limo that is filled with giggling women, all drinking champagne. We see a montage of newspaper headlines. Record crowds are flocking to see the undefeated, all-powerful, and amazing Spider-Man. Spider-Man loves the attention. He's driven to a disco. He accidentally removes the car door. Once inside the disco, he spins and dances on a pair of roller skates. Teenage girls all scream and cheer and applaud as Spider-Man releases years of pent-up shyness. He's drunk and dances to the loud music like a superstar. Hours later, Spider-Man is super drunk as he vomits in a booth. Any door he attempts to open comes off in his hand with web glue. He washes his face and sobers up. The next morning, Peter starts smoking cigarettes to be more like his agent. Harry sees him and tells that he needs to get a grip, that he's acting rude and obnoxious. Peter, unaware of his strength, shoves Harry off his feet into a nearby garden. "I don't need anyone anymore," he says, and he storms into the house and pushes aside a shocked Aunt May. Uncle Ben follows Peter upstairs and slaps him in the face. Peter goes quiet. He realizes the hurt and damage he's done. The next day at school, Peter falls asleep during science class. His teachers note that Peter's losing his way as a student recently. Liz tries to talk to him, but he calls her an airhead, and so she slaps him in the face. Flash plots revenge on Peter. He gums up Peter's locker, but Peter opens it anyway, and the contents tumble on Flash's head. He goes to hit Flash, but stops himself, knowing that one strike could be lethal. That afternoon, Spider-Man and Maxie appear on a talk show. Spider-Man is being pitched as one of the greatest stars to ever emerge from wrestling, a sporting superstar. Crusher Hogan is now happily retired and sits on a panel next to the amazing Spider-Man. Also on the game show, they're planning to reveal to the audience the world's most expensive diamond gem, which is why Knight, Rico, and Dee have bought tickets for the show and sit in the audience. As Spider-Man's segment continues, the host tries to unmask Spider-Man, but Spider-Man refuses and walks off. Meanwhile, the gang spots security guards in the wings, waiting with the gem. They cover their faces and ambush the guards. Spider-Man lets the masked thieves run away. The host addresses the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're live, and we've just witnessed an attempted robbery of one of the rarest jewels in the world." The host asks Maxie why Spider-Man didn't do anything to help stop the robbery. "My client doesn't fight unless he gets paid for it," he says. Uncle Ben works in his store. It's late in the evening. Peter offers money to Uncle Ben with an apology, but Ben refuses both. "Maybe you should find yourself a new place to live with all that money you're making," he says. Peter continues to wrestle at night. His agent warns that he's beating up contenders way too hard and to relax. "I signed a wrestler, not a murderer," he says. As Uncle Ben approaches the end of his shift, he starts to close the store. He's unaware that in the shadows is Knight. His face is covered and he holds a knife. He enters the store. "Don't move, old man. I want all your money. No tricks," he says. Ben reaches for a concealed shotgun beneath the counter. The two struggle, and the gun accidentally fires. Ben staggers back and falls to the floor. Knight stands frozen in regret before running off. News of the shooting reaches Aunt May and Peter. Peter is furious. He bows his head, slams his fist down, shattering the table. He looks at his wrestling costume. Spider-Man. What a joke, he says. His rage takes over. He smashes up his bedroom, and at the peak of his rage, he begins to transform into a spider, an actual giant spider. The sight of his mutating tissue gives him a horrific fright. As his temper subsides, so do the effects of the transformation. Peter puts on his Spider-Man costume and jumps out of the window. Peter swings through the street and arrives at a nightclub. He's looking for Knight. He knows now that Knight is the suspect whom police believe killed his uncle, and this is Knight's hangout spot. The nightclub bouncer refuses to give him any information and calls him a freak. So, Spider-Man lifts the bouncer above his head and threatens to throw him down the steps. The bouncer tells Spider-Man to ask for Rico at the pool hall. Spider-Man swings away and crashes through the pool hall window. He grabs Rico by the throat. "Tell me where Knight is or I'll snap your worthless neck," he says. 6 of Rico's bat-wielding buddies attack, but Spider-Man beats everyone unconscious. Rico escapes during the chaos. He runs straight to Knight's hideout in an abandoned part of the high school. Spider-Man swings in pursuit high above and out of view. "The Spider-Man is after you!" calls out Rico to Dee and Knight. The trio find each other. Spider-Man descends from above. Knight shoots his pistol. Spider-Man dodges the bullets and uses his web shooter to render the gun useless. He leaps and lifts Rico and Dee off their feet and sends them both crashing through a high-rise window into a mound of trash. Knight flees, shooting as he runs away. Spider-Man gives chase down the darkened corridors. A bullet grazes Spider-Man's face, weakening him. Knight gains the advantage. He's out of bullets, so he uses a chair to smash Spider-Man's face, hitting him in the body, in the back of the head. They crash through a wall. Spider-Man is dazed, bleeding. The beating blinds him. Knight moves in for the kill, but Spider-Man's spidey sense kicks in. He dodges the frantic attack and leaps, clinging to the ceiling. He leaves the room and fires webs down the hallway. At full stretch, he fastens webbing to either side of him and catapults himself toward Knight. He sends him flying into the opposite wall. The two fight a long and bloody fist fight until Peter overpowers and beats the punk to the ground. Spider-Man stands over his fallen foe and takes off his mask to reveal his identity. "Parker," says a surprised Knight. He gets up and they fight some more. Spider-Man lifts Knight above his head. "Kill me, Parker!" He grins. "Kill me or I'll come back for you, man! Kill me or I'll nail you like your chump uncle!" There's a protruding bar spiking out of the gymnasium wall. Spider-Man hurls Knight straight towards it, towards imminent death, before shooting a web that cocoons him and pulls him back, saving his life. "I could have killed you, remember that," he says. He spots the mask from the Diamond Gem TV studio robbery in Knight's pocket. "Oh no," he says, realizing that Knight is the same thief he let escape with the gem. He hears distant sirens. He leaves Knight's slumped body and returns home to apologize to Aunt May. Once alone, he slides a new Spider-Man mask over his face and fires his web shooter towards the Brooklyn Bridge as a new day dawns. The end. Roll credits. I'm guessing the Pyun Goldman script was hammered out in a very short amount of time. It reads like a handful of scenes that have been overly stretched and extended to pad out a feature-length screenplay. It's clear that the story had been geared towards a shooting budget as low as technically possible, which no doubt restricted the scope of what could be written. The whole film is pretty much based around the moment from Amazing Fantasy issue 15, where, upon first realizing his super strength and agility, Peter spends 3 minutes in the ring with Crusher Hogan for prize money. Along with the seminal moment from the same issue, where Peter confronts Uncle Ben's killer and realizes that it's the same criminal he let slip past him earlier. And that's pretty much it. The threat level and sense of jeopardy never feels that high, given that the villain of the story is a teenage hoodlum. This is no fault of Pyun's, of course. The director was now literally tasked with writing a no-budget film. Meanwhile, Pyun's unproduced plot for the He-Man sequel would have picked up after Skeletor's post-credit sequence in the original movie. After surviving his fall into the pits beneath Castle Grayskull and taunting the viewer with his evil grin and the words, "I'll be back," Skeletor is able to transport himself back to Earth in the form of evil billionaire industrialist Aaron Dark. Learning of this, He-Man collects a band of friends from across the galaxy, and then has Gwildor teleport him back to Earth. Once there, He-Man and friends plan to track down Skeletor and defeat him to save the people of Earth. To blend into society, he takes on the form of a football star. Skeletor ultimately destroys most of the world before He-Man can stop him, and the screenplay ended in a devastated post-nuclear world. Comedy moments included a set piece where He-Man and Gwildor befriend a group of teenagers who take them to a local disco and try to teach him how to dance. Pyun would later say, quote, "The concept was to shoot 2 weeks of Spider-Man first, the section of Peter Parker's story before he was bitten. Then we would shoot 6 weeks of Masters 2. I knew that Canon had the rights to Spider-Man and sequel rights to Masters of the Universe. I also knew that the Spider-Man rights were about to expire. I proposed to Menahem Golan and Yoram Globus that I make both pictures back-to-back in North Carolina. Canon agreed, and I cast both pictures. I can't remember who we cast for Peter Parker, but big wave surfer Laird Hamilton was cast as He-Man. Brooklyn sets for Spider-Man were built on the Wilmington stages, and I had a number of creative discussions with Stan Lee and Joe Calamari of Marvel. I wanted to use the black Spidey costume, but this was vetoed. The script was based on the original story only. The budget was my largest at $6 million. Masters of the Universe 2 was based on my story. Sets and costumes were built. The film was fully cast. Mattel Toys had a great many approvals, and it was a trying process getting everything okayed by the corporate giant. It had a budget of $4.5 million. Weeks away from the shoot date, it was discovered that Canon had bounced checks to renew the rights to Mattel and Marvel, canceling the deal. And it was discovered that Mattel was owed a large rights payment as well. With Canon in deep financial straits, the negotiations with Marvel and Mattel fell apart. Having already spent up to $2 million on sets, costumes, and preparation, Golan and Globus were desperate to find a way to recoup their spend. Pyun suggested they do a film that could incorporate as much of what had been built and prepped. He wrote a first draft of what became the Jean-Claude Van Damme movie Cyborg over a weekend, and brought in actor and writer Don Michael Paul to help with redrafts. Don Michael Paul would also rewrite the Shepard Goldman Spider-Man script. He would take the mysterious character of Dr. Tanner, who goes nowhere in the existing screenplay, and expand him into an all-out villain. The new draft would keep Peter Parker as a high school senior and skilled science student. He accepts a position working for the insidious Dr. Russell Tanner, who in this draft is a rogue scientist secretly creating genetic hybrids. Peter discovers what the Doctor is really up to and flees, but not before he's bitten by a spider infected with radioactive enzymes. As Dr. Tanner injects himself with serum, he becomes the horrifying Night Ghoul, a genetic hybrid of human and vampire bat. The improved screenplay was budgeted at a cost still deemed too expensive to pull off. The disintegration of the creative process wasn't helped by the fact that Golan's connection to the material still remained as weak as ever. "Why doesn't he turn into the spider?" he would frequently ask. Ethan Wiley then did a page-one, ground-up revamp of the existing Night Ghoul storyline. Wiley was told to write within the parameters of a $5 million budget, as there wasn't a lot of money to play with, and the debt collectors were closing in fast. He was instructed that the priority was simply getting the thing made before the contract expired. Wiley was told that although the company owned the rights to put the character of Spider-Man in a movie, there was a lack of clarity as to which other characters from the Spider-Man universe could be included. And so, rather than use the classic villains, Dr. Octopus or the Green Goblin, Wiley was told to invent an original supervillain of his own. Wiley had received praise for his work on the horror movies House and House 2, and he also had the valuable experience of effects and production from his time working on Gremlins and Return of the Jedi. This would allow him to tailor his script into something that could be done with no to low budget. Wiley's script was to only have Parker become Spider-Man near the end of the film. Given that there'd be no money to spend on aerial stunts, New York locations, and expensive blue screen work, Wiley says he decided to focus on the evolution of Peter into Spider-Man as a metaphor for him being a teenager growing into an adult. Wiley's plot would see Peter Parker working for an esteemed doctor. The doctor is a paraplegic, making groundbreaking advances in the field of genetic research. Parker and his fellow students respect and admire the brilliant doctor and assist him in his work. However, the doctor has personal motivation for what he does. He's trying to reverse his paralysis so that he can walk again, and has since become obsessed and megalomaniacal in his single-minded quest for a breakthrough. The doctor has been excluded and banished by his medical peers as his methods and techniques become more sinister over time. We learn that he is secretly conducting unethical genetic experimentations. The doctor funds his immoral work by harnessing a synthetic derivative drug called T-Devil. The highly addictive powder is sold to the mob and reproduced in mass quantities, and in turn, its use explodes into an all-out epidemic across New York. The effects of the drug gives users a 24-hour high of superpowers and elevated strength and ability, much like a superhero. But there's a potential side effect. Your heart explodes and you die. Peter's origin story is intact. He's bitten by a genetically modified spider. He attempts to cash in on his new powers and appears on television. He's shunned by the media and unsure what to do with his new talents. We see Uncle Ben's death and Peter's subsequent epiphany as he decides to honor his true calling as a hero. Once the doctor's illicit work is uncovered, Peter realized that his mentor and father figure has betrayed him, that he essentially helped the deranged doctor create the drug responsible for destroying his friends' lives. The doctor then injects himself with a serum that contains the properties of a scorpion. Scorpion Man and Spider-Man do battle in a warehouse, a set specifically written so that the one location shoot would reduce costs and logistics. The script ends with Peter Parker accepting his moral responsibility and realizing that he was destined to become Spider-Man. Wiley would say, quote, "I actually thought it made a pretty compelling story. Now, the idea was that if it did well and was successful, then you were really set up to do a series of Spider-Man movies. You kind of used the first movie to set up the premise of the following sequels. In story number 2, you've got money because the first one was successful. Now you jump right into the adventure, and you don't have to tell his origin. At least, that was my clever idea, but not clever enough, I guess." On the brink of collapse, Cannon Films was taken over by Pathé Communications, a holding company controlled by Italian financier Giancarlo Perretti. "Perretti was our savior," Golan would tell the film press in France. "Exactly 1 year ago, in May 1987, we reached an agreement. Money started to pour in, and finance people started to come and work with us. Financed by Crédit Lyonnais, the state-owned French bank which began to invest heavily in filmmaking around that time, Perretti loaned $250 million to pay off Cannon's debt. Perretti and his business partner Florio Fiorini had previously established a network of untraceable shell companies that would be used as a complex cover to obscure the ownership of all future acquisitions. They stumbled into show business when, after working with a Roman Catholic organization in Italy, he was asked to oversee their production of Bernadette, a film based on the life of a peasant girl who saw visions of the Virgin Mary in the French town of Lourdes in the 1850s and was sanctified. Perretti loved it, but Fiorini was uncomfortable making a religious film. He insisted that Perretti sell their interest in Bernadette to the movie's distributor, the Cannon Group, and to remove their name from it. Instead, Perretti decided he wanted to buy the Cannon Group wholesale. Perretti was a colorful and controversial figure, to say the least. An Italian tycoon ex-waiter who owned hotels, a real estate company, a travel agency, and an insurance firm. Perretti was found innocent on charges of fraud and extortion going back to 1981 and 1986 in Naples and Sicily. "People bring me to trial, but I've never been found guilty," Perretti would tell the press. "I've been charged and arrested 3 times, but always been acquitted." Perretti would later secure $1.3 billion to audaciously acquire the studio MGM. To help secure his down payment, Perretti sold off all of MGM's home video assets which he didn't yet even own. Through Cannon, Perretti now held control of movie houses, the largest movie theater chain across Europe, plus film studios in Italy and France. Stan Lee was losing patience with what was fast becoming a public farce. He spoke to a gathering at a sales conference that year and said, quote, "The Spider-Man movie has been the longest ongoing disaster you have ever heard of. Cannon has had 10 scripts already, each one worse than the one before. Every year you'll read in the trades, 'Coming soon, Spider-Man, don't miss it.' Well, miss it, please, until we get a good script." By 1989, Golan and Globus would sever their long-term working relationship. Golan, citing differences with both Perretti and Globus, resigned from his position, while Globus remained, for now at least. Once Golan had been driven out, it wouldn't be too long before Globus would also see himself ejected from the board. In lieu of payments Golan felt was owed to him, he negotiated to retain the rights to the Cannon projects Spider-Man and Captain America. As part of Golan's severance deal, he would also be handed the reins to the studio 21st Century. The company had been founded in 1976 as 21st Century Distribution Corporation, and would later file for bankruptcy in 1989. That's when Perretti bought the company and rebranded it as 21st Century Film Corporation. Once Golan was in position, he told the press that his new company would produce only high-quality, big-budget movies, and that the sky was the limit. The Spider-Man rights were set to expire, so Golan negotiated a 2-year extension. Using the materials previously created during the Zito phase of development, Golan would fashion all of the storyboard art, the posters, and the original Newsom Brancato script into a package that would entice buyers to purchase the home video and television rights to the as-yet unmade Spider-Man. Every cent raised would go towards the eventual budget. That was the plan. Albert Pyun would go on to make 1990's Captain America for 21st Century Films. It was a production that was rushed out for the wrong reasons. It was fraught with budget cuts and technical limitations. Pyun says, quote, "I knew that Cannon had Captain America too. I was a big Captain America fan, and everyone kept saying that Stephen Tolkien's script for the movie was really great. And when I got to read it, I agreed, it was. So when Menahem Golan was splitting from Cannon, I lobbied for him to bring it with him to his new company 21st Century. Then I heard that the option on that was expiring too, so I went and pitched my take on the project, and he gave me a very quick green light to shoot the movie in Yugoslavia. I was very excited. But the promised production funds never really materialized, and it impacted the film in a lot of ways. For 21st Century Films' Spider-Man, Golan wanted to ignore the various rewrites, including his own, and go back to 1985's Newsom Brancato draft. Frank LaLoggia was then attached. LaLoggia had written and directed one movie at that point, 1988's truly brilliant and atmospheric supernatural gem, Lady in White. LaLoggia's treatment is an 83-page story dated December 89. It loosely follows the Golan rewrite of Cohen's rewrite of the Brancato Newsom script. LaLoggia's take would retain the Wiener henchman, who was again responsible for the murder of Uncle Ben during a fumbled attempt to visit Peter's home and recruit him for Doc Ock's gang. In this version, Octavius is Peter Parker's professor. also working on developing a mob-funded anti-gravity gun. His colleagues, Thorkel and Rosamov, are reduced to a brief mention as Octavius is again fired in disgrace and the science department explodes. Peter and Octavius are transformed into their respective alter egos during the accident. Once Octavius escapes from the hospital with the melded tentacles, he tells the mob they work for him now and kills the Godfather. Elsewhere, Peter's Uncle Ben has health problems, which is causing a financial strain. So, once Peter has acquired and figured out his new Spider-Man strength, he takes part in the wrestling competition for a cash prize. The henchman Wiener sees the mystery wrestler, and Doc Ock wants him to join them. Both Wiener and the FBI now separately pursue the true identity of the mysterious Spider-Man. Wiener kills Peter's agent and finds out Parker's name. He tracks down the home address and kills Uncle Ben in the melee that follows. Ock, meanwhile, had planned to set Wiener up and kills him with a drive-by bazooka blast. As Ock's anti-gravity weapon creates carnage all over the city, Ock holds the populace ransom. He kidnaps Peter's friend, Liz Allen, and flees in his blimp. Spider-Man is in pursuit, and the two ultimately lock horns in Ock's secret underground lab. The evil lair is positioned directly beneath City Hall. The technology causes the building to defy gravity and begin to float upward. Spider-Man and Dr. Octopus fight, and Ock is thrown to his death. The end, pretty much. Stan Lee had sent in a new treatment that he was hoping would be considered, but by now, Golan had again decided that he wanted to co-write the screenplay himself, as Joseph Goldman alongside Neil Ruttenberg. Ruttenberg would later tell Ed Gross that, quote, "My experience on Spider-Man wasn't exactly fulfilling. I desperately wanted to get back to the character's roots, but no one at 21st Century seemed particularly interested in doing so. I wanted to go back to the comic book. I had a good relationship with Stan Lee, though he was more of an idea guy. It wasn't really hands-on for him. He liked to sit around and talk a lot. We had a pretty good working relationship." Stan Lee's treatment, a 53-page document titled Spider-Man: The Untold Story, is a cartoon-like story that sees professor-turned-master criminal Dr. Octopus fight with Spider-Man. The text is broken down into 6 chapters and features all the familiar beats from the trademark origin. The Daily Bugle, radioactive spider bite, Peter initially pursuing a showbiz career, Flash Thompson is a bully towards Peter but idolizes Spider-Man. Peter catches Uncle Ben's killer and realizes it's the same thief he indifferently let run by him a few days earlier. Liz Allen is his just friend's classmate, although the character of Harry Osborn is curiously missing. Lee's subplots would see a mystery woman, Dana, revealed to be Doc Ock's daughter, pursue Peter and later seduce him. And Octavius, who walks around with his pet bird on his shoulder, inadvertently ends up as Aunt May's lodger and object of affection. The final clash takes place on a levitating UN building during a summit of world leaders as the city is held to a $1 billion ransom. Neil Ruttenberg says he also had a good relationship with Golan, but that the whole process of him writing Spider-Man was completely hamstrung by Golan's yes men and the incompetent story editor at 21st Century. Ruttenberg was looking to fully utilize Dr. Octopus and to explore the heightened sense of teenage angst within Peter following his transformation. He says he had a vision of Spider-Man acrobatically moving through the air using big-budget aerial stunt work. But, he says, the troublesome story editor wanted Spider-Man to be more like a lowbrow, risque comedy for teens. Ruttenberg was left disillusioned with the misinformed and tacky approach the company were taking, and he decided to end all connection to the project. Lee's latest treatment, alongside all work done by Ruttenberg, wouldn't amount to anything, as around this time, Golan was looking to strike a deal with Columbia TriStar that would see the Sony-owned studio fund, produce, and distribute the movie based on the original Newsom Brancato story. Simultaneous to these negotiations, Golan would also get courted by Carolco Pictures. It was on May 19, 1990 at the Cannes Film Festival where Carolco Pictures' chief Mario Casar would invite Golan aboard his luxury yacht and told him if he didn't accept Columbia's offer and instead sold to them, then they'd invest $50 million into making a Spider-Man movie that would spawn a multi-million-dollar franchise. "They wooed me for a whole day on that boat," Golan said. Golan says he had only one condition, and his one condition was that any Spider-Man movie made by Carolco was to credit his name as producer. Golan claimed he was the one that first saw potential in the project when the rest of Hollywood laughed and refused to touch it. Carolco agreed to the solitary condition, and negotiations were completed as the sun went down. Carolco agreed to pay $5 million in a deal that would potentially see Golan earn $1 million personally. Golan would never see his fee. And events were about to get a little crazy. It was then announced that James Cameron had signed a deal to direct a Spider-Man movie that would be based on his own script, for which he'd receive an upfront fee of $3 million. Cameron would tell the press at the time that, quote, "I'm doing the origin story, and then going way beyond that and delving into the whole story of teenage angst. What if you were 17 years old and you could do whatever you wanted anytime you wanted? There's going to be all the webs and stuff, but it's also going to be deeply philosophical. He's a senior in high school, and I'm playing it the way it was originally written. One of the things that really interests me, possibly in Spider-Man, possibly in some other later project, is going into some very bizarre and surreal imagery that can only be done using computer-generated images. I want to try something really wild. Before, there were limits to what you could do in special effects, but now there are no impossibilities. If you can imagine it, you can definitely put it up there on the screen." The story then goes that the office printer at Carolco wasn't working. And so, rather than wait to print up the Spider-Man contract, the Terminator 2 one was used as a substitute. Carolco recycled the terms of Cameron's Terminator 2 contract word for word, replacing the title Terminator with the name Spider-Man. But the T2 contract had given Cameron final approval over every name in the credits, and Cameron didn't want Golan's name on his movie. Golan had observed that none of Carolco's publicity for the Spider-Man featured his name, as promised. Golan claims that Carolco spent the next several months trying to pressure him into giving up his claim to the producer credit, even withholding part of the $5 million it owed 21st Century for the Spider-Man rights. Cameron wouldn't budge, and neither would Golan. On April 20th, 1993, 21st Century Film Corporation and Menahem Golan filed an action against Carolco in Los Angeles County Superior Court, alleging claims for breach of contract, anticipatory breach of contract, and fraud relating to the motion picture project Spider-Man. Golan sought compensatory damages in excess of $5 million, plus unspecified punitive damages, attorney's fees, a complete rescission of the Carolco 21st Century Films' legal contract, not to mention a preliminary and permanent injunction preventing Carolco and its associates from distributing Spider-Man or issuing press releases or other information to the media without according producer credit to Golan. Golan's lawsuit was followed by 5 more. In February of 1994, Carolco sued Viacom and TriStar separately to nullify their television and home video rights. TriStar and Viacom countersued Carolco, 21st Century, and Marvel. MGM, which is part of the Path Group, considered itself the inheritor of Canon's old Spider-Man rights, sued Golan, Globus, Perretti, 21st Century, Viacom, TriStar, and Marvel for fraud, amongst other things. Within a year, further complications arose. Carolco, 21st, and Marvel had each filed for bankruptcy. In the wake of Titanic's global success, Cameron felt that his Spider-Man moment had passed. He told Premiere in 1998 that, quote, "Here's where I am philosophically. I'm 44. I make a movie every 2 or 3 years. It should be something that I create. I've always done that, with the exception of Aliens. The Terminator was my creation. So were Titanic and The Abyss. With the amount of time and energy that I put into a film, it shouldn't be somebody else's superhero. I don't want to labor in somebody else's house." Cameron spoke more recently of his ideas from nearly 30 years ago and said, quote, "I wanted to make something that had a kind of gritty reality to it. The superheroes in general always come off as kind of fanciful to me, and I wanted to do something that would have been more in the vein of Terminator and Aliens, that you buy into the reality right away. So you're in a real world. You're not in some mythical Gotham City, or Superman and the Daily Planet and all that sort of thing, where it always felt very kind of metaphorical and fairy tale-like. I wanted it to be, it's New York. It's now. A guy gets bitten by a spider. He turns into this kid with these powers, and he has this fantasy of being Spider-Man. And he makes this suit, and it's terrible. And then he has to improve the suit. And his big problem is the damn suit. Things like that. I wanted to ground it in reality and ground it in universal human experience. I think it would have been a fun film to make." In conclusion, Ted Newsom and John Brancato's Spider-Man screenplay, never getting made when planned, would initiate a domino effect across the next 36 years. And it ultimately led to December 2021's Spider-Man No Way Home, featuring actor Tom Holland as Peter Parker. No Way Home was a sequel to Spider-Man Homecoming, released in 2017, and Spider-Man Far From Home, released in 2019. The trilogy was directed by John Watts. The plot of No Way Home picked up 1 week after the events of Far From Home, when, following Quentin Beck's attacks across Europe and the subsequent framing of Spider-Man for his murder, Spider-Man's civilian identity as Peter Parker is revealed to the world. Peter asks Doctor Strange for help. A spell is cast so that the world may forget about Spider-Man. The resulting spell accidentally creates a fracture in the multiverse, and familiar villains from other parallel universes are summoned. Peter's friends would then unintentionally bring other alternate reality Peter Parkers into this universe. It was a much heralded movie that would see the return of actors Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire, who had previously starred as Spider-Man in their own film franchises. Andrew Garfield's reprisal of the role in No Way Home was a return to the character he had first portrayed 9 years earlier in 2012's The Amazing Spider-Man, and again in its 2014 sequel. The Amazing Spider-Man duology, directed by Mark Webb, didn't get a third installment, despite a penciled-in release date of June 10th, 2016, with Part 4 scheduled for May 4th, 2018. The Sony franchise wouldn't proceed any further, and the canceled plans would also put an end to planned titles for The Sinister Six, The Black Cat, and a Venom and Carnage movie. The Amazing Spider-Man movies in themselves were a cinematic retool of the character following the cancellation of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 4 in January 2010. Raimi's preceding trilogy of Spider-Man movies had starred the aforementioned Tobey Maguire, the first of which premiered in April of 2002, and would fulfill Stan Lee's nearly 30-year-long wish to see Spider-Man swing across the cinema screen. Lee would film a cameo, and upon the release of the smash hit movie, Lee would say that he absolutely loved Tobey Maguire's take on the character. He told reporters, "Tobey is Peter Parker. I love him and what he did for Spider-Man." Lee would also go on record to say that Raimi's first Spider-Man is his favorite comic book movie of all time. As an interesting aside, Raimi and Lee had worked together on developing a movie for the Marvel character Thor 10 years prior, but the studio saw no potential in the Son of Odin. Raimi would later say, quote, "We worked on a story based on his Thor stories, then we took it around to pitch to the different studios. And I couldn't believe that they didn't regard Stan more highly back then. This was probably 1991 or something, and he was treated like just another writer. Oh, great, you write comic books, big deal. I remember going to 8 different studios and then looking at 8 different rejection slips, saying, how could they say no to this? Well, they'd say things like, people are kind of touchy about their gods. And I'd go, yeah, but it's not like a religious picture. He's the god of thunder. They so didn't get it. Nonetheless, principal photography on Spider-Man began on Monday morning, January 8th, 2001. The shooting script, dated January the 9th and 22nd of 2001, was a final draft forged from 16 months of work. Earlier drafts across August, October, and December of 2000 would refine the story and bring Norman Osborn's Green Goblin into the fold as the film's central villain. The decision to utilize the Green Goblin came after earlier drafts, dated 16th August and November 7th of 1999, would see Spider-Man originally do battle against Max Dillon's Electro and Boyd the Sandman, accumulating in an epic battle atop New York's Twin Towers. The draft had come immediately after the 8-year legal battle over the movie rights had finally come to an end. Columbia Pictures said it would move swiftly to place the property into production. The idea is to do it now, as fast as we can. It's a big tentpole movie, said Amy Pascal, Columbia's president, following the legal victory. Columbia's parent, Sony Pictures Entertainment, also won the rights to produce sequels to the initial picture and to any live-action television series. Sony and Marvel Enterprises also said they would establish a 50-50 joint venture to license Spider-Man-related merchandise, including toys, games, and apparel that could generate billions of dollars in revenue. Ted Newsom would read all of the drafts and see that an early version featured Dr. Octopus and an adversarial colleague who thwarts Oc's work and triggers his villainous behavior. There was also a scene where Parker discards his glasses after discovering that they now blur his suddenly perfect eyesight, a scene that does not appear in the comics, along with other aspects that were never featured in a Spider-Man comic. Newsom contacted the Writers Guild for a potential hearing, as he saw Sam Raimi's film to be the result of the preceding years of drafts and treatments, and according to Guild standards, even the inclusion of small details from original sources sometimes warrants screenwriting credit for the initial screenwriter. Newsom spoke to the LA Times prior to the Spider-Man premiere, and recalled seeing the script that featured Doc Ock. Newsom would say, quote, "That was the flag that went up. I said to myself, this may be more complicated than I thought." The question I had for the Guild was pretty academic. I'd seen the Cameron treatment and knew it was substantially different from the previous material. It may be too late to argue for credit. It's idiotic because the film will make $500 million, and this was never about money. There's a bigger wrong to address here than one guy's script 17 years ago. What's the good of having the Guild if producers can circumvent it by not paying for something? The Guild took the official stance that, quote, "Not everyone who has ever worked on a project has a right to arbitration." They said that the right was solely reserved for what is termed participating writers, meaning only writers who were employed by the production company that are making the film for a period of at least 3 months. Because Spider-Man was now a property of Columbia Pictures, and Columbia had never hired Newsom, the Guild contended that this nullified his right to a hearing. Newsom attempted to catalog all of the subsequent rewrites and restarts of his screenplay. Some of the later writers would also begin to note aspects that may or may not have arisen from their own drafts. Ethan Wiley would say, quote, "It smells funny if you're the paranoid type. I can't understand why the Guild insists that 5 or 8 drafts of Spider-Man don't exist. They exist, and there's a clear lineage. It's a major problem." Wiley felt a loophole was being exploited because the companies that hired the previous writers were now out of business, and since the screenplay is said to belong to the production house and not the writers themselves. Wiley would say, quote, "I began to see that there could be an opportunity for further abuses. A producer might say, I'm not going to technically obtain that material, and thus would have no obligation to give credit. and that puts writers in a precarious position. At the heart of this matter was the Cameron treatment. It was officially decided that Cameron's work is where the evolution starts, and anything pre-Cameron that came during the canon 21st century era was declared as not up for debate. If it could be proven that Cameron had taken elements from earlier works, then there would possibly be a case. But Cameron's spokesman would state that all of his work on Spider-Man was adapted from issues of the comic books and imagination. The statement read, quote, "He was aware that some prior writers' material existed, and he elected not to read any of it." And speaking of credit, Menahem Golan would never receive the producer title on Spider-Man he had desired for so long. In 2012, Golan would tell journalist Tim Tal that, quote, "Had I produced Spider-Man, the canon group would still exist today. That's true because Spider-Man achieved big box office success. Even if you don't do it well, it would have been a box office success, and that would have kept Canon Group above the board. The company was broken by big loans from banks. Banks did not want to support us anymore. It was a big mess, you know? I owned the rights for Spider-Man for 7 years, but I never got to do it. The budget was too big for us to raise. We needed like $100 million. We couldn't raise it, we were too small. So later, we sold the rights to another company. I bought the rights for $400,000 and sold it for $1 million, so we made some money. And finally, the film was made, and it turned out to be good. And so, we emerge, once again, from another deep dive into the murky and turbulent seas of unmade cinema. As always, thanks for watching.